Section number 15 of Little Journeys to the Home of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Naomi Brewster, Melbourne, Australia. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Albert Hubbard. Chapter 15, Part 1. Ludwig van Beethoven. Melody has by Beethoven been freed from the influence of fashion and changing taste, and raised to an ever-valid, pure human type. Beethoven's music will be understood to all time, while that of his predecessors will, for the most part, only remain intelligible to us through the medium of reflection on the history of art. Richard Wagner. Music is the youngest of the arts. Modern music dates back about 400 years. It is not so old as the invention of printing. As an art, it began with the work of the priests of the Roman Catholic Church in endeavouring to arrange a liturgy. The medieval chant and the popular folk song came together, and the science of music was born. Sculpture reached perfection in Greece, painting in Italy, portraiture in Holland. But Germany, the land of thought, has given us nearly all the great musicians and 9/10 of all our valuable musical compositions. Holland has taken a very important part in every line of art and handicraft, and in a way of all-round development has set the pace for civilization. Art follows in the wake of commerce, for without commerce there is neither surplus wealth nor leisure. The artist is paid from what is left after men have bought food and clothing, and the time to enjoy comes only after the struggle for existence. When Venice was not only queen of the Adriatic, but of the maritime world as well, art came and established there her court of beauty. It was Venice that mothered Giorgione, Titian, the Bellinis, and the men who wrought in iron and silver and gold, and those masterful bookmakers. It was beautiful Venice that gave sustenance and encouragement to Stradivari, who made violins as well as he could, up to Cremona, only a few miles away. But there came a day when all those 70 bookmakers of Venice ceased to print, and the music of the anvils was stilled, and all the painters were dead, and Venice became but a monument of things that were, as she is today. For commerce is king, and his capital has been moved far away. So Venice sits sad and solitary, a pale and beautiful ruin, pathetic beyond speech, invested by noisy shopkeepers and petty pilferers, and the degenerate sons of the robbers who once roamed the sea and enthroned her on her 100 isles. All that Venice knew was absorbed by Holland. The Elzevirs and the Plantins took over the business of the 70 bookmakers, and the art schools of Amsterdam, Leyden, and Antwerp reproduced every picture of note that had been done in Venice. The great churches of Holland are replicas of the churches of Venice, and the cathedral of Antwerp, where the sweet bells have chimed each quarter of the hour for 3 centuries, through peace and plenty, through lurid war and sudden death, there where hangs Rubens' masterpiece, that cathedral is but an enlarged Santa Maria de Frari, where for 200 years hung the Assumption by Titian. In these churches of Holland were placed splendid organs, and the priests formed choirs and offered prizes for the best singing and the best compositions. Music and painting developed hand in hand, for at the last all of the arts are one, each being but a division of labour. The world owes a great debt to the Dutch. It was Holland taught England how to paint and how to print, and England taught us. So our knowledge of printing and painting came to us by way of the apostolic succession of the Dutch. The march of civilization follows a simple trail, well defined beyond dispute. Viewed in retrospect, it begins in a hazy thread stretching from Assyria into Egypt, from Egypt into Greece, from Greece to Rome, widening throughout Italy and Spain, then centering in Venice, and tracing clear and deep to Amsterdam, widening again into Germany and across to England, and thence carried in Mayflowers to America. That remark of Charles Dudley Warner, once near neighbour to Mark Twain, that there is no culture west of Buffalo, was indelicate if not unkind, and residents of Omaha aver that it is open to argument. But the fact stands beyond a cavil that what art we possess is traceable to our masters, the Dutch. It must be admitted that the art of printing was first practised at Mayence on the Rhine, leaving the Chinese out of the equation, but it had to travel around down through Italy before it reached perfection, and its universality and usefulness were not fully developed until it had swung around to Holland and was given by the Dutch back to Germany and the world. And as with printing, so with music. Germany has specialized on music. She has succeeded, but it is because Holland gave her lessons. During the forepart of the 17th century there lived in Antwerp Ludwig van Beethoven, grandfather of the genius known as Beethoven. A life-size portrait of him can be seen in the Platen Musée, and if you do not know that the picture was painted before Beethoven was born, you would say at once, Beethoven! There is a look of stern endurance, as if the artist had admired Rembrandt's Burgomaster a little too well. Yet that sturdiness belonged to the master too, and there are the abstracted far-away look, the touch of proud melancholy, and the becoming unkemptness that we know so well. The child is grandfather to the man. Beethoven bore slight resemblance to his immediate parents, but in his talents, habits, and all his mental traits, he closely resembled this sturdy Dutchman who composed, sang, led the military band, and played the organ at the church of St. Jacques in Antwerp. Being ambitious, Ludwig van Beethoven, while yet a young man, moved to Bonn, the home of Clement Augustus, Archbishop Elector of Cologne. The chief business of elector was, in case of necessity, to elect a king. America borrowed the elector idea from Germany, but our electoral college is a degenerate political appendicle that is continued because in borrowing plans of government we took good and bad alike, not knowing there was a difference. The elector scheme in the United States is occasionally valuable for defeating the will of the people in case of a popular majority. In justice, however, let me say that the original argument of the colonialists was that the people should not vote directly for president, because the candidate might live a long way off, and the voter could not know whether he was fit or not. So they let the citizen vote for a wise and honest elector he knew. The result is that we all now know the candidates for president, but we do not know the electors. The Electoral College in America is just about as useful as the two buttons on the back of a man's coat, put there originally to support a sword belt. We have discarded the sword, yet we cling to our buttons. But the electors of Germany, in days agone, had a well-defined use. The people were not, at first, troubled to elect them. The king did that himself, and then, as one good turn deserves another, the electors agreed to elect the successor the king designated, when death should compel him to abdicate. Then, to fill in the time between elections, the electors did the business of the king. It will thus be seen that every elector was really a sort of king himself, governing his little state, amenable to no one but the king. And so the chief business of the elector was to keep the people in his diocese loyal to the king. There have always existed three ways of keeping the people loving and loyal. One is to leave them alone, to trust them and not to interfere. This plan, however, has very seldom been practised, because the politicians regard the public as a cow to be milked, and something must be done to make it stand quiet. So they try plan number 2, which consists in hypnotizing the public by means of shows, festivals, parades, prizes, and many paid speeches, sermons and editorials, wherein and whereby the public is told how much is being done for it, and how fortunate it is in being protected and wisely cared for by its divinely appointed guardians. Then the band strikes up, The flags are waved, 3 passes are made, 1 to the right and 2 to the left, and we, being completely under the hypnosis, hurrah ourselves hoarse. Plan number 3 is a very ancient one and is always held back to be used in case number 2 fails. It is for the benefit of the people who do not pass readily under hypnotic control. If there are too many of these, they have been known to pluck up courage and answer back to the speeches, sermons, and editorials. Sometimes they refuse to hurrah when the bass drum plays, in which case they have occasionally been arrested for contumacy and contravention by stocky men in wide-awake hats who lead the strenuous life. This plan number 3 provides for an armed force that shall overawe, if necessary, all who are not hypnotized. The army is used for 2 purposes: to coerce disturbers at home and to get up a war at a distance, and thus distract attention from the troubles near at hand. Napoleon used to say that the only sure cure for internal dissension was a foreign war. This would draw the disturbers away, on the plea of patriotism, so that they would win enough outside loot to satisfy them, or else they would get killed. It really didn't matter much. And as for loot, if it was taken from foreigners, there was no sin. A careful analyst might here say that plan number 3 is only a variation of plan number 2, the end being gained by hypnotic effects in either event. For the army is conscripted from the people to use against the people, just as you turn steam from a boiler into the firebox to increase the draught. Possibly this is true, but I have introduced this digression anyway, only to show that the original office of elector was a wise and beneficent function of the government, and could be revived with profit in America, to replace the outworn and useless vermiformis we now possess in way of an electoral college. When kings allowed church and state to separate, they made a grave mistake. With the 2 united, as they were until a more recent time, they held a cinch on both the souls and the bodies of their subjects. In the good old days in Germany, the elector was always an archbishop. Our bishops are now a weakling lot. With no army to back their edicts, the people smile at their proclamations, try on their shovel hats, and laugh at their gaiters. Or, if they be Methodist bishops, who are only make-believe bishops, having slipped the cable that bound them to the past, we pound them familiarly on the back and address them as Bish. Clement Augustus, Elector of Cologne, maintained a court that vied with royalty itself. In his household were 200 servants. He had coachmen, footmen, cooks, messengers, a bodyguard, musicians, poets, and artists, who hastened to do his bidding. He patronized all the arts, made a pet of science, offered a reward for the transmutation of metals, dabbled in astrology, and practised palmistry. Into this brilliant court came the strong and masterful Ludwig van Beethoven. In a year his gracious present, superb voice, and rare skills as a musician pushed him to the front and into favour with the powers, with a yearly salary of 400 guilders. The history of this man is a deal better raw stock for a romance than the life of his grandson. From 1732, when he entered the court as an unknown and ordinary musician with an acceptable tenor voice, to 1761, when he was Kapellmeister and member of the private council of Elector, his life was a steady march successward. Strong men were needed, then as now, and his promotion was deserved. Various accounts and mention of this man are to be found, and one contemporary described him as he appeared at 60. The only mark of age he carried was his flowing white hair. His smoothly shaven face shows the strong features of a man of 35, and his carriage, actions, and superb grace as an orchestra leader made him a conspicuous figure in any company. Ludwig van Beethoven had one son, Johann by name. This boy resembled his gifted father very little, and his training was such that he early fell a victim to arrested development. If a parent does everything for a child, the child probably will never do anything for himself. It is nature's plan. She seems to think that no one needs strength excepting the struggler, and being kind she comes to his rescue. But the man who puts forth no effort remains a weakling to the end. Johann placed success beyond his reach very early in life by putting an enemy into his mouth to steal away his brains. His marriage to a daughter of a cook in Ehrenbreitstein Castle did not stop his waywardness, or give him decision, as was hoped. Marriage, as a scheme of reformation, is not always a success, and women who lend themselves to it take great chances. Mary Magdalena was a widow, and some say possessed of wiles. That she was beneath Johann in social station, but beyond him in actual worth, there is no doubt. And whether she snared the incautious man, or whether the marriage was arranged by the elder Beethoven as a diplomatic move in the interests of morality, matters little. The end justifies the means, and as a net result of this mating, without putting forward the circumstance as a precedent to be religiously followed, the world has Beethoven and his work. End of section 15. Section number 16 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Naomi Brewster, Melbourne, Australia. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Albert Hubbard. Chapter 16, Part 2. A plate affixed to number 515 Bonn Gas, Bonn, gives the birth of Ludwig van Beethoven as December 17th, 1770. He was the second-born child of his mother, and after him came a goodly assortment of boys and girls. Two of his brothers lived to exercise a sinister influence over the life of the master, and to darken days that should have been luminous with love. Little Ludwig was the pet and pride of the grandfather. The grandfather had even insisted that the baby should bear his name. Disappointment in his own child caused him to centre his love in the grandchild. This instinct that makes men long to live again in the lives of their children, is it reaching out for immortality? And as the grandfather virtually supported the household, he was allowed to have his own way, and indeed that strong yet chary will was not to be opposed. The old man prophesied what the boy would do, just as love ever does and has done since the world began. But only in his dreams was Ludwig van Beethoven to know of the success of his namesake. When the boy was scarce 4 years old, the old man passed away. The place in the orchestra that Johann held through favour was soon forfeited, and times of pinching poverty followed, and sorrows came like the gathering of a winter night. Have you never shared the mocking shame and biting pain of a drunkard's household? Then God grant you never may. When the world withdraws its faith from a man through his own imbecility, and employment is denied, then promises are unkept. When order and systems are gone, and foresight fled, and louder accusation, threat and contumely vary their strident tones with maudlin protestations of affection, and vows made to be broken, easily changed to curses. When the fire dies on the hearth, and children huddle in a bed in the daytime for warmth, when the scanty food that is found is eaten ravenously, and blanching fear comes when a heavy tread and fumbling at the lock are heard in the hall, these things challenge language for fit expression, and cause words to falter. The moody and dispirited Johann one day conceived a bright thought, a thought so vivid that for the moment it cleared the cobwebs from his mind and sobered his boozy brain. The genius of his 5-year-old boy should be exploited to retrieve his battered fortunes. The child was already showing signs of musical talent, and diligent practice was now begun. Several chums at the beer gardens were interviewed, and great plans unfolded in very enthusiasm. The services of several of these men were secured as tutors, and one of them, Pfeiffer, took lodgings with the Beethovens, and paid for bed and board in music lessons. A new thought is purifying, ideas are hygienic, and already things had begun to look brighter for the household. It wasn't exactly prosperity, but Johann had found a place in the band, and was earning as much as $3 a week, which amount for 2 weeks running he brought home and placed in his wife's lap. But things were grievous for young Beethoven. He had 2 taskmasters, his father and Pfeiffer. One gave him lessons on the violin in the morning, and the other took him to a tavern where there was a clavichord and made him play all afternoon. Then occasionally Johann and Pfeiffer would come home at 2 o'clock in the morning from a concert where they had been playing and where the wine was red and also free, and they would drag the poor child from his bed to make him play. This was followed up until the boy's mother rebelled, and on one occasion Pfeiffer and Johann were sent to the military hospital and dry-docked for repairs. On the whole, this man Pfeiffer was kindly and usually capable. In after years Beethoven testified to the valuable assistance he had received from him, and when Pfeiffer had grown old and helpless, Beethoven sent funds to him by the publishers Simrock. Young Ludwig was a stocky, sturdy youth, decidedly Dutch in his characteristics, with no nerves to speak of, else he would have laid him down and died of heart chill and neglect, as did 4 of his little brothers and sisters. But he stood the ordeals, and at parlour, tavern, and beer-garden entertainments where he played, although his cheeks were often stained with tears, he took a great pride in being able to do things which even his father could not. And then he was always introduced as Ludwig Beethoven, a grandchild of Ludwig van Beethoven, and this was no mean introduction. His appearance even then bore strong resemblance to the lost and lamented grandfather, and Van en Eden, the court organist, in loving remembrance of his Antwerp friend, took the lad into his keeping and gave him lessons. When Van den Eden retired, Neef, his successor, took a kindly interest in the boy, and even protected him from his father and the zealous Pfeiffer. So well was the boy thought of, that when he was 12 years of age, Neef established him as his deputy at the chapel organ. Shortly after this, the new elector, Max Friedrich, bestowed on Louis van Beethoven, my well-beloved player upon the organ and clavichord, a stipend of 150 florins a year, and if his talent doth increase with his years, the amount is to be also increased. In token of the elector's recognition, Beethoven wrote 3 sonatas, the earliest of his compositions, and dedicated them to Max Friedrich in 1782. In 1784, Elector Max Friedrich died, and Max Franz was appointed to take his place. His inauguration was a signal for a renewal of musical and artistic activity. Concerts, shows, military pageants followed the installation. In a list of court appointments we find that Louis van Beethoven is put down as second organist, with a salary of £45 a year. Below this is Johann Beethoven with a salary of £30 a year, and in one of the court journals mention is made of Johann Beethoven with the attached line, "Father of Ludwig Beethoven," showing even then the man's source of distinction. In 1787, when in his 18th year, Beethoven made a visit to Vienna in company with several musicians from the Elector's court at Bonn. This visit was a memorable event in the life of the master, every detail of which was deeply etched upon his memory, to be effaced only by death. It was on this visit to Vienna that he met Mozart, and played for him. Mozart gave due attention, and when the player had ceased he turned to the company and said, "Keep your eye on this youth, he will yet make a noise in the world." The remark, if closely analysed, reveals itself as non-committal, and although it has been bruited as praise the round world over, it was probably an electrotyped expression used daily, for great musicians are called upon at every turn to listen to prodigies. I once attended rhetoricals where the Honourable Chauncey M. Depew was president. Being called upon to make a few remarks, the senator from New York arose and referred to one of the speeches given by a certain sophomore as unlike anything I have ever heard before. Genius very seldom recognizes genius. Beethoven had a self-sufficiency, even at that early time, that stood him in good stead. He felt his power and knew his worth. That steadfast, obstinate quality in his make-up was not in vain. He let others quote Mozart's remark, but he had matched himself against the master, and was not abashed. Kinship is a question of spirit and not a matter of blood. How often do we find persons who, in feeling, are absolutely strangers to their own brothers and sisters? Occasionally even parents fail to understand their children. The child may hunger for sympathy and love that the mother knows nothing of, and cry itself to sleep for a tenderness withheld. Later this same child may evolve aspirations and ambitions that seem to the other members of the family mere whims and vagaries to be laughed down or stoutly endured as the mood prompts. Knowing these things, do we wonder at the question of long ago, who is my mother, and who are my brethren? Beethoven was a beautiful brown thrush in a nest of cuckoos. He could sing and sing divinely, and the members of his household were glad because it brought an income in which they all shared. About the year 1795, Beethoven went to Vienna, and as he had been heralded by several persons of influence, his reception was gracious. Charity has its periods of evolving into a fad, and at this time the fashion was musical entertainments in aid of this or that. Slight suspicions exist that these numerous entertainments were devised by fledgling musicians for their own aggrandizement, and possibly patrons fanning the philanthropic flame to help on their protégés. Beethoven was of too simple and guileless a nature to aid his fortunes with the help of any social jimmy, but we see he was soon in the full tide of local popularity. His ability as a composer, his virile presence, and his skill as a player made his company desired. From playing first for charity, then at the houses of nobility, and next as a professional musician, he gradually mounted to the place to which his genius entitled him. Then we find his brothers, Karl and Johann, appearing on the scene, with a fussy yet earnest intent to take care of business affairs of their eccentric and absent-minded brother. Ludwig let himself fall into their way of thinking. It was easier than to oppose them, and they began to drive bargains with publishers and managers. Their intent was to sell for cash and at the highest market, and their strenuous efforts after the main chance put their gifted brother in a bad plight before the world of art. Beethoven's brothers seized his very early and immature compositions and sold them without his consent or knowledge. So humiliated was Beethoven by seeing these productions of his childhood hawked about that he even instituted lawsuits to get them back that he might destroy them. To boom a genius and cash his spiritual assets is a grave and delicate task. Perhaps it is one of those things that should be left undone. Much anguish did these rapacious brothers cause the divinely gifted brown thrush, and when they began to quarrel over the receipts between themselves, he begged them to go away and leave him in peace. He finally had to adopt the ruse of going back to Bonn with them, where he got them established in the apothecary business before he dared manage his own affairs. But they were bad angels, and the wind of their wings withered the great man as they hovered around him down to the day of his death. Then silence settled down upon Beethoven, and every piano was for him mute, and he, the maker of sweet sounds, could not hear his own voice, or catch the words that fell from the lips of those he loved. Fate seemed to have done her worst. And so he wrote, "Forgive me then if you see me turn away, when I would gladly mix with you. For me there is no recreation in human intercourse, no conversation, no sweet interchange of thought. In solitary exile I am compelled to live. When I approach strangers, a feverish fear takes possession of me, for I know that I will be misunderstood. But, O God, Thou lookest down upon my inward soul. Thou knowest and Thou seest the love for my fellow men, and all kindly feeling have their abode here. Patience, I may get better, I may not, but I will endure all until death shall claim me, and then joyously will I go. The man who could so express himself at 28 years of age must have been a right brave and manly man. But art was his solace, as it should be to every soul that aspires to become. Great genius and great love can never be separated. In fact, I am not sure but that they are one and the same thing. But the object of his love separated herself from Beethoven when calamity lowered. What woman, young, bright, vigorous and fresh, with her face to the sun rising, would care to link her fate with that of a man sore-stricken by the hand of God? And then there is always a doubt about the genius. Isn't he only a fool after all? Art was Beethoven's solace. Art is harmony, beauty and excellence. The province of art is to impart a sublime emotion. Beethoven's heart was filled with divine love, and all love is divine, and through his art he sought to express his love to others. But his physical calamity made him the butt and byword of the heedless wherever he went. Within the sealed-up casements of his soul, Beethoven heard the heavenly choir, and as he walked bareheaded upon the street, oblivious to all, centred in his own silent world, he would sometimes suddenly burst into song. At other times he would beat time, talk to himself and laugh aloud. His strange actions would often attract a crowd, and rude persons, ignorant of the man they mocked, would imitate him or make mirth for the bystanders as they sought to engage him in conversation. At such times the master might be dragged back to earth, and seeing the coarse faces and knowing the hopelessness of trying to make himself understood, he would retreat in terror. 6 months or more of each year were spent in the country in some obscure village about Vienna. There he could walk the woods and traverse the fields alone and unnoticed, and there, out under the open sky, much of his best work was done. The famous Moonlight Sonata was shaped on one of these lonely walks by night across the fields, when the master could shake his shaggy head, lift up his face to the sky, and cry aloud, all undisturbed. In the recesses of his imagination he saw the sounds. There are men to whom sounds are invisible symbols of forms and colours. The law of compensation never rests. Everything conspired to drive Beethoven in upon his art. It was his refuge and his retreat. When love spurned him, and misunderstandings with kinsmen came, and lawsuits and poverty added their weight of woe, he fell back upon music, and out under the stars he listened to the sonatas of God. Next day he wrote them out as best he could, always regretting that his translations were not quite perfect. He was ever stung with a noble discontent, and in times of exultation there ran in his deaf ears the words, "Arise, and get thee hence, for this is not thy rest." And so his work was in a constant ascending scale. Richard Wagner has acknowledged his indebtedness to Beethoven in several essays, and in many ways. In fact, it is not too much to say that Beethoven was the spiritual parent of Wagner. From his admiration of Beethoven, Wagner developed the strong, sturdy, independent quality of his nature that led to his exile and his success. Behold the face of Ludwig Beethoven. Is there not something titanic about it? What selfness, what will, what resolve, what power! And those tear-stained eyes, have they not seen sights of which no tongue can tell, nor tongue can make plain? His life of solitude helped foster the independence of his nature, and kept his mind clear and free from all the idle gossip of the rabble. He went his way alone, and played court fool to no titled and alleged nobility. The democracy of the man is not our least excuse for honouring him. He was one with the plain people of earth, and the only aristocracy he acknowledged was the aristocracy of intellect. In the work done after his 40th year there is great freedom, and ease, and increasing strength, with a daring quality which uplifts and gives you courage. The tragic interest and intense emotionalism are gone, and you behold a resignation and the success it wins by yielding. The man is no longer at war with destiny. There is no struggle. We pay for everything we receive. Nay, all things can be obtained if we but pay the price. One of the very few emancipated men in America brought redemption from the bondage of selfish ambition at a terrible price. Years and years ago he was in the Rocky Mountains, rough, uneducated, heedless of all that makes for righteousness. This man was caught in a snowstorm on the mountainside. He lost his way, became dazed with cold, and fell exhausted in the snow. When found by his companions the next day, death had nearly claimed him. But skilful help brought him back to life. Yet the frost had killed the circulation in his feet. Both legs were amputated just below the knees. This changed the current of the man's life. Foot races, boxing matches, and hunting of the big game were out of the question. The man turned to books and art and questions of science and sociology. 30 summers have come and gone. This gentle, sympathetic, and loving man now walks with a cane, and few know of his disability and his artificial feet. Speaking of his spiritual rebirth, this man of splendid intellect said to me with a smile, "It cost me my feet, but it was worth the price." I shed no maudlin tears over the misfortunes of Beethoven. He was what he was because of what he endured. He grew strong by bearing burdens. All things are equalized. By the cross is the world redeemed. God be praised. It is all good. End of section 16.
Section 17 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 5, Part 1. George Handel. When generations have been melted into tears or raised to religious fervor, when courses of sermons have been preached, volumes of criticisms been written, and thousands of afflicted and poor people supported by the oratorio of the Messiah, it becomes exceedingly difficult to say anything new. Yet no notice of Handel, however sketchy, should be written without some special tribute of reverence to this sublime treatment of a sublime subject. Bach, Graun, Beethoven, Spohr, Rossini, and Mendelssohn have all composed on the same theme. But no one in completeness, in range of effect, in elevation and variety of conception, has ever approached Handel's music upon this one subject. Rev. H. R. Haweis. George Handel. "Did you meet Michelangelo while you were in Rome?" asked a good Roycroft girl of me the other day. "No, my dear, no," I answered, and then I gulped hard to keep back some very foolish tears. "No, I did not meet Michelangelo," I said. "I expected to, and was always looking for him, but these eyes never looked into his, for he died just 300 years before I was born." But how natural was this question from this bright country girl! She had been examining a lot of photographs of the Sistine Chapel, and had seen pictures of El Penseroso, the Night and Morning, the Moses, and then she had seen on my desk a bronze cast of the hand of the David, that imperial hand with the gently curved wrist. These things lured her, the splendid strength and suggestion of power in it all had caught her fancy, and the heroic spirit of the master seemed very near to her. It all meant pulsating life and hope that was deathless, and the thought that the man who did the work had turned to dust 3 centuries ago never occurred to this naive, budding soul. Did you see Michelangelo while you were in Rome? No, dear girl, no. But I saw St. Peter's that he planned, and I saw the result of his efforts, things worked out and materialized by his hands, hands that surely were just like this hand of the David. The artist gives us his best, gives it to us forever, for our very own. He grows aweary and lies down to sleep and wake no more, deeding to us the mintage of his love. And as love does not grow old, neither does art. Fashions change, but hope, aspiration, and love are as old as fate who sits and spins the web of life. The artist is one who is educated in the 3 H's, head, heart, and hand. He is God's child, no less are we, and he has done for us the things we would have liked to do ourselves. The classic is that which does not grow old. The classic is the eternally true. Did you meet Michelangelo in Rome? Why, it is the most natural question in the world. At Stratford I expected to see Shakespeare. At Weimar I was sure to meet Goethe. Rubens just eluded me at Antwerp. At Amsterdam I caught a glimpse of Rembrandt. In the dim cloisters of St. Mark's at Florence I saw Savonarola in cowl and robe. Over Whitehall in London I beheld the hovering smoke of martyr fires, and knew that just beyond the walls Ridley and Latimer were burned. And only a little way outside of Jerusalem a sign greets the disappointed traveler thus: He is risen, he is not here. In one of his delightful talks that are as fine as his feats of leadership, Walter Damrosch has referred to Handel as a contemporary. Surely the expression is fitting, for in the realm of truth time is an illusion and the days are shadows. George Frederick Handel was born in 1685 and died in 1759. His dust rests in Westminster Abbey, and above the tomb towers his form cut in enduring marble. There he stands, serene and poised, accepting benignly the homage of the swift-passing generations. For over 100 years this figure has stood there in its colossal calm, and through the cathedral shrines, the aisles, and winding ways of dome and tower, Handel's music still peals its solemn harmonies. At Exeter Hall is another statue of Handel, seated, holding in his hand a lyre. At the Foundling Hospital, which he endowed, is a bust of the master, done in 1758, and at Windsor is the original of still another bust that has served for a copy of the very many casts in plaster and clay that are in all the shops. There are at least 50 different pictures of Handel, and nearly this number were brought together on the occasion of a recent Handel and Haydn festival at South Kensington. When Gladstone once referred to Handel as our greatest English composer, he refused to take it back, even when a capricious critic carped and sneezed. Handel essentially belongs to England, for there his first battles were fought, and there he won his final victory. To be sure, he did some preliminary skirmishing in Germany and Italy, but that was only getting his arms ready for that conflict which was to last for half a century, a conflict with friends, foes, and fools. But Handel was too big a man to be undermined by either the fulsome flattery of friends or the malice of enemies, who were such only because they did not understand. And so always to the fore he marched, zigzagging occasionally, but the voice said to him, as it did to Columbus, "Sail on, and on, and on." Like the soul of John Brown, the spirit of Handel goes marching on. And Sir Arthur Sullivan was right when he said, "Musical England owes more to Father Handel than to any other 10 men who can be named. He led the way for us all, and cut out a score that we can only imitate." At the court of George of Brunswick at Hanover in 1709 was George Frederick Handel, 6 feet 1, weight 180, rubicund, rosy, and full of romp, aged 24. George of Brunswick was to have the felicity of being King George the First of England, and already he was straining his gaze across the Channel. At his court were divers and sundry English noblemen. Handel was a prime favorite with every one in the merry company. The ladies doted on him. A few gentlemen, possibly, were slightly jealous of his social prowess, and yet none pooh-poohed him openly, for only a short time before he had broken a sword in a street duel with a brother musician, and once had thrown a basso profundo who sang off key through a closed window, all this to the advantage of a passing glazier, who, being called in, was paid his fee 3 times over for repairing the sash. "It's an ill wind," etc. Handel played the harpsichord well, but the organ better. In fact, he played the organ in such a masterly way that he had no competitor, save a phenomenal yokel by the name of Johann Sebastian Bach. These men were born just a month apart. Saint Cecilia used to whisper to them when they were wee babies. For several years they lived near each other, but in this life they never met. Handel was an aristocrat by nature, even if not exactly so by birth, and so had nothing to do with the modest and bucolic Bach, even going so far, they do say, as to leave, temporarily, the city of Halle, his native place, when a contest was suggested between them. Bach was the supreme culminating flower of 250 years of musical ancestors, servants to this Grand Duke or that. But in the tribe of Handel there was not a single musical trace. George Frederick succeeded in the art, and at it, in spite of his parents. But never mind that. He had been offered the post as successor to Buxtehude, and Buxtehude was the greatest organist of his time. He accepted the invitation to play for the Buxtehude contingent. A musical jury sat on the case, and decided to accept the young man, with the proviso that Handel, taught by Orpheus, should take to wife the daughter of Buxtehude, this in order that the traditions might be preserved. Young Handel declined the proposition with thanks, declaring he was unworthy of the honor. Young Handel had spent 2 years in Italy, had visited most of the capitals of Europe, had composed several operas and numerous songs. He was handsome, gracious, and talented. Money may use its jimmy to break into the upper circles, but to beauty, grace, and talent that does not shiver or shrink, all doors fly open. And now the English nobleman requested, nay, insisted, that Handel should accompany them back to merry England. He went, and being introduced as Signore Handello, he was received with salvos of welcome. There is a time to plant and a time to reap. There is a time for everything. Launch your boat only at full of tide. London was ripe for Italian opera. Discovery had recently been made in England that art was born in Italy. It had traveled as far as Holland, and so Dutch artists were hard at work in English manor houses, painting portraits of ancestors, dead and living. Music, one branch of art, had made its way up to Germany, and here was an Italian who spoke English with a German accent, or a German who spoke Italian. What boots it, he was a great musician. Handel's Italian opera, Rinaldo, was given at a theatre that stood on the site of the present Haymarket. The production was an immense success. All educated people knew Latin, or were supposed to know it, and Signore Handello announced that his Italian was an improvement on the Latin. And so all the scholars flocked to see the play, and those who were not educated came too, and looked knowing. In order to hold interest, there were English syncopated songs between the acts. Ragtime is a new word, but not a new thing. Handel was very wise in this world's affairs. He assured England that it was the most artistic country on the globe. He wrote melodies that everybody could whistle. Airs from Rinaldo were thrummed on the harpsichord from Land's End to John o' Groat's. The Grand March was adopted by the Life Guards, and at least one air from that far-off opera has come down to us, the Tasci ch'io piange, which is still listened to with emotion unfeigned. The opera, being uncopyrighted, was published entire by an enterprising Englishman from Dublin by the name of Walsh. At 2 o'clock one morning at the Turk's Head he boasted he had cleared over £2,000 on the sale of it. Handel was present and responded, "My friend, the next time you will please write the opera, and I will sell it." Walsh took the hint, they say, and sent his cheque on the morrow to the author for £500, and the good sense of both parties is shown in the fact that they worked together for many years and both reaped a yellow harvest of gold guineas. On the birthday of Queen Anne, Handel inscribed to her an ode, which we are told was played with a full band. The performance brought the diplomatic Handel a pension of £200 a year. Next, to celebrate the Peace of Utrecht, the famous Te Deum and Jubilate were produced, with a golden garter as a slight token of recognition. But good Queen Anne passed away, as even good queens do, and the fuzzy-witted George of Hanover came over to be King of England, and transmit his fuzzy-wuzzy wit to all the Georges. About his first act was to cut off Handel's pension, because, he said, Handel ran away from me at Hanover. A time of obscurity followed for Handel, but after some months, when the royal barge went up the Thames, a band of 100 pieces boomed alongside, playing a deafening racket, with horse-pistol accompaniments. The king made inquiries, and found it was water music, composed by Herr Handel, and dedicated in loving homage to King George I. When the royal barge came back down the river, Herr Handel was aboard, and accompanied by a great popping of corks, was proclaimed court musician, and his back pension ordered paid. A low ebb of art is seen in that, in the various operas given about this time by Handel, great stress is made in the bills about costumes, scenery, and gorgeous stage fittings. When accessories become more than the play, illustrations more than the text, millinery more than the mind, it is unfailing proof that the age is frivolous. Art, like commerce and everything else, obeys the law of periodicity. Handel saw the tendency of the times, and advertised, "The fountain to be seen in Amadigi is a genuine one, the pump real, and the dog alive." 3 hours before the doors opened, the throng stood in line, waiting. End of section 17. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California. Section 18 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 5, Part 2. George Handel. But London is making head. Other good men and true are coming to town. Handel does not know much about them, or care perhaps. His wonderful energy is now manifesting itself in the work of managing theatres and concerts, giving lessons in composing songs, arias, operas, and attending receptions where "the ladies refrain from hoops for fear of the crush," to use the language of Samuel Pepys. In shirt sleeves, in a cheap seat in the pit, at one of Handel's performances, is a big lout of a fellow with scars of scrofula on his neck and cheek. Next to him is a little man, and these two, so chummy and confidential, suggest the long and short of it. They are countrymen, recently arrived, empty of pocket, but full of hope. They have a selfish eye on the stage, for the big 'un has written a play, and wants to get it produced. The little man's name is David Garrick, the other is Samuel Johnson. They listen to the singing, and finally Samuel turns to his friend and says, "I say, Davy, music is nothing but a noise that is less disagreeable than some others." They would go away, would these two, but they have paid good money to get in, and so sit it out disgustedly, watching the audience and the play alternately. In one of the boxes is a weazened little man, all out of drawing, in a black velvet doublet, satin breeches, and silk stockings. At his side is a rudimentary sword. The man's face is sallow, and shrewdness and selfishness are shown in every line. He looks like a baby suddenly grown old. The two friends in the pit have seen this man before, but they have never met him face to face, because they do not belong in his set. "Do you think God is proud of a work like that?" at last asked Davy, jerking his thumb toward the bad modeling in courtly black. "God never made him." The big man swayed in his seat, and added, "God had nothing to do with him. He is the child of Beelzebub." "Think ye so?" asks Davy. "Why, Mephisto has some pretty good traits, but Alexander Pope is as crooked as an interrogation point, inside and out. I hear he wears 5 pairs of stockings to fill out his shanks, and sole leather stays to keep him from flattening out like a devilfish," said Dr. Johnson. "But he makes a lot of money." "Well, he has to, for he pays an old woman 100 guineas a year to dress and undress him." "I know, but she writes his heroic couplets, too." "Davy, I fear you're getting cynical. Let's change the subject." It surely is a case of artistic jealousy. Our friends locate the poet Gay, a fat little man, who is with his publisher, Rich. "They say," says Samuel, again rolling in his seat as if about to have an apoplectic fit, "they say that Gay has become rich, and Rich has become gay since they got out that last book." There comes an interlude in the play, and our friends get up to stretch their legs. "How now, Dick Savage," calls Samuel, as he pushes 3 men over like 9 pins to seize a shabby fellow whose neckcloth and haircut betray him as being a poet. "How now, Dick, you said that Italian music was damnably bad. Why do you come to hear it?" "I came to find out how bad it is," replied the literary man. Your reverence?" he adds to his companion, a sharp-nosed man with china-blue eyes, in Church of England knee-breeches, high-cut vest, and shovel hat. Dean Swift replies with a knowing smirk, which is the nearest approach to a laugh in which he ever indulged. Then he takes out his snuff-box and taps it, which is a sign that he is going to say something worth while. "Yes, one must go everywhere and do everything just to find out how bad things are. By this means we clergymen are able to intelligently warn our flocks. But I came to-night to hear that rogue Bononcini. You know he is from County Down. I used to go to school with him," and the dean solemnly passes the snuff-box. Garrick here bursts into a laugh, which is broken off short by a reproving look from the dean, who has gotten the snuff-box back and is meditatively tapping it again. The friends listen and hear from the muttering lips of the dean this: "Some say that Signore Bononcini, compared to Handel, is a ninny, whilst others vow that to him Handel is hardly fit to hold a candle. Strange all this difference should be 'twixt Tweedledum and Tweedledee." The people are tumbling back to their seats as the musicians come stringing in. Soon there is a general tuning up, scrapings, toots, snorts, subdued screeches, raspings, and all that busy buzz-fuzz business of getting ready to play. The first time we came to the opera, Dr. Johnson thought this was all part of the play, and applauded with unction for an encore, says Garrick. And I heard nothing finer the whole evening, answers Dr. Johnson, excepting the defy and winning by yielding. Why don't they tune up at home or behind the scenes? Asked someone. I'll tell you why, says Savage, and he relates this. Handel is a great man for system. He is a strict disciplinarian, as any man must be to manage musicians, who are neither men nor women, but a third sex. Often Handel has to knock their heads together, and once he shook the Cuzzoni until her teeth chattered. That's the way you have to treat any woman before she will respect you, interrupts the dean. Nothing else being forthcoming, Savage continues. Handel is absolute master of everything but death and destiny. Now he didn't like all this tuning up before the audience. He said you might as well expect the prima donna to make her toilet in front of the curtain. I like the idea, says Johnson. Savage praises the interruption and continues. And so ordered every man to tune up his artillery a half-hour before the performance, and carry his instrument in and lay it on his chair. Then, when it came time to commence, every musician would walk in, take up his instrument, and begin. The order was given and all tuned up. Then the players all adjourned for their refreshments. In the interval a wag entered and threw every instrument out of key. It came time to begin. The players marched in like soldiers. Handel was in his place. He rapped once. Every player seized his instrument as though it were a musket. At the second rap the music began, and such music! Some of the strings were drawn so tight that they snapped at the first touch. Others merely flapped. Some growled, and others groaned and moaned or squealed. Handel thought the orchestra was just playing him a scurvy trick. He leaped upon the stage, kicked a hole in the bass viol, and smashed the kettle drum around the neck of the nearest performer. The players fled before the assault, and he bombarded them with cornets and French horns as they tumbled down the stairs. The audience roared with delight, and not 1 in 40 guessed that it was not a specially arranged Italian feature. But since that evening all tuning up is done on the stage, and no man lets his instrument get out of his hands after he gets it right. It's a moving tale, invented as an excuse for a man who writes music so bad that he gets disgusted with it himself and flies into wrath when he hears it, says Johnson. A subdued buzz is heard, and the master comes forth, gorgeous in a suit of purple velvet. His powdered wig and the enormous silver buckles on his shoes set off his figure with the proper accent. His florid face is smiling, and Garrick expresses a regret that there are to be no impromptu tragic events in way of chasing players from the stage. "Would you like to meet him?" asks the sharp-nosed dean. Garrick and Johnson have enough of the rustic in them to be lion hunters, and they reply to the question as one man. "Yes, indeed." "I'll arrange it," was the answer. The leader raps for attention. Johnson closes his eyes, sighs, and leans back resignedly. The others look and listen with interest as the play proceeds. The other day I read a book by Madame Colombier entitled Sarah Barnum. Only a person of worth could draw forth such a fire of hot invective, biting sarcasm, and frenzied vituperation as this volume contains. When I closed the volume it was with the feeling that Sarah Bernhardt is surely the greatest woman of the age, and I was fully resolved that I must see her play at the first opportunity, no matter what the cost. And as for Madame Colombier, why, she isn't so bad either. The flashes of lightning in her sword-play are highly interesting. The book was born, as all good books, because its mother could not help it. Behind every page and between the lines you see the fevered toss of human emotion and hot ambition. These women were rivals. There were digs and scratches, bandied epithets in falsetto, and sounds like a piccolo, played by a man in distress before all this. And these are not explained, so you have to fill them in with your imagination. But the Bernhardt is the bigger woman of the two. She goes her splendid pace alone, and all the other woman can do is to bombard her with a book. The excellence of Handel is shown in that he achieved the enmity of some very good men. Read The Spectator, and you will find its pages well peppered with thrusts at foreigners and sweeping cross-strokes at Italian opera and all bombastic beaters of the air who smother harmony with bursts of discord in the name of music. These battles royal between the kings of art are not so far removed from the battles of the beasts. Rosa Bonheur has pictured a duel to the death between stallions. And that battle of the stags, horn-locked, with the morning sun revealing death as victor by Landseer, is familiar to us all. Then Landseer has another picture which he called The Monarch, showing a splendid stag, solitary and alone, standing on a cliff, overlooking the valley. There is a history behind this stag. Before he could command the scene alone he had to vanquish foes, but in the main, in some way, you feel that most of his battles have been bloodless, and he commands by divine right. The divine right of a king, if he be a king, has its root in truth. One mark of the genius of Handel is shown in the fact that he has achieved a split and created a ruction in the society of scribblers. He once cut Dean Swift dead at a fashionable gathering, the doughty Dean, who delighted in making men and women alike crawl to him, and this won him the admiration of Colley Cibber, who immortalized the scene in a sonnet. People liked Handel or they did not, and among the old guard who stood by him let these names among others be remembered: Colley Cibber, Gay, Arbuthnot, Pope, Hogarth, Fielding, and Smollett. People who through incapacity are unable to comprehend or appreciate music are prone to wax facetious over it. The feeble joke is the last resort of the man who does not understand. The noisy denizens of Grub Street, drinking perdition to that which they cannot comprehend, always getting ready to do great things, seem like fussy pygmies beside a giant like Handel. See the fifth act ere the curtain falls on the lives of Oliver Goldsmith, Dr. Johnson, Steele, Addison, and Dean Swift, dead at the top the last, and the others unhappily sent into night, and then behold George Frederick Handel in his 75th year, blind, but with inward vision all aflame, conducting the oratorio of Elijah before an audience of 5,000 people. The life of Handel was packed with work and projects too vast for one man to realize. That he deferred to the London populace and wrote down to them at first is true, but the greatness of the man is seen in this: he never deceived himself. He knew just what he was doing, and in his heart was ever a shrine to the ideal, and upon this altar the fires never died. Handel was a man of affairs as well as a musician, and if he had loved money more than art, he could have withdrawn from the fray at 30 years of age, passing rich. 3 times in his life he risked all in the production of grand opera, and once saw a sum equal to $50,000 disappear in a week through the treachery of Italian artists who were pledged to help him. At great expense and trouble he had gone abroad and searched Europe for talent, and, regardless of outlay, had brought singers and performers across the sea to England. In several notable instances these singers had, in a short time, been bought up by rivals, and had turned upon their benefactor. But Handel was not crushed by these things. He was philosopher enough to know that ingratitude is often the portion of the man who does well, and a fight with a fox you have warmed into life is ever imminent. At 55, a bankrupt, he made terms with his creditors, and in a few years pays off every shilling with interest, and celebrates the event by the production of Saul, the Dead March from which will never die. The man had been gaining ground, making head, and at the same time educating the taste of the English people. But still they lagged behind, and when the oratorio of Joshua was performed, the master decided he would present his next and best piece outside of England. Jealousy, a dangerous weapon, has its use in the diplomatic world. Handel set out for Dublin with 100 musicians there to present the Messiah, written for and dedicated to the Irish people. The oratorio had been turned off in just 21 days, in one of those titanic bursts of power of which this man was capable. Its production was a feat worthy of the Frohmans at their best. The performance was to be for charity, to give freedom to those languishing in debtors' prisons at Dublin. What finer than that the Messiah should give deliverance? The Irish heart was touched. A fierce scramble ensued for seats, precedence being emphasized in several cases with blackthorns deftly wielded. The price of seats was a guinea each. Handel's carriage was drawn through the streets by 200 students. He was crowned with shamrock and given the freedom of the city in a gold box. Freedom even then, in Ireland, was a word to conjure with. Long before the performance, notices that no more tickets would be sold were posted. The doors of the debtors' prison were thrown open, and the prisoners given seats so they could hear the music, thus overdoing the matter in true Irish style. The performance was the supreme crowning event in the life of Handel up to that time. Couriers were dispatched to London to convey the news of Handel's great triumph to the newspapers, bulletins were posted at the clubs, the infection caught. On the return of the master a welcome was given him such as he had never before known. Dublin should not outdo London. When the Messiah was given in London, the scene of furor in Dublin was repeated. The wild tumult at times drowned the orchestra, and when the Hallelujah chorus was sung the audience arose as one man and joined in the song of praise. And from that day the custom has continued. Whenever in England the Messiah is given, the audience arises and sings in the chorus, as its privilege and right. The proceeds of the first performance of the Messiah in England were given to charity, as in Dublin. This act, with the splendor of the work, subdued the last lingering touch of obdurate criticism. The man was canonized by popular acclaim. Many of his concerts were now for charity. The Foundlings' Home, the Seamen's Fund, Home for the Aged, hospitals and imprisoned debtors, all came in for their share. Handel never married. That remark of Dean Swift's, "I admire Handel principally because he conceals his petticoat peccadilloes with such perfection," does not go. Handel considered himself a priest of art, and his passion spent itself in his work. The closing years of his life were a time of peace and honor. His bark, after a fitful voyage, had glided into safe and peaceful waters. The calamity of blindness did not much depress him. "What matters it so long as I can hear?" he said. And good it is to know that the capacity to listen and enjoy, to think and feel, to sympathize and love, to live his ideals, were his, even to the night of his passing hence. End of Section 18, recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.
Section 19 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.L. Baldwin. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard, Chapter 10, Part 1. Of all the operas that Verdi wrote, the best, to my taste, is the Trovatore, and Mario can soothe, with a tender note, the souls in purgatory. The moon on the tower slept soft as snow, and who was not thrilled in the strangest way, as we heard him sing with the lights burned low, "Non ti scordar di me." But oh, the smell of that jasmine flower, and oh, the music, and oh, the way that voice rang out from the dungeon tower, "Non ti scordar di me, non ti scordar di me." Bulwer Lytton. Giuseppe Verdi. He sort of clung to the iron pickets, did the boy, and pressed his face through the fence and listened. Someone was playing the piano in the big house, and the windows with their little diamond panes were flung open to catch the evening breeze. He listened. His big gray eyes were open wide, the pupils dilated. He was trying to see the music as well as hear it. The boy's hair matched the yellow of his face, being one shade lighter, sun-bleached from going hatless. His clothes were as yellow as the yellow of his face, and shaded off into the dust that strewed the street. He was like a quail in a stubble field. You might have stepped over him and never seen him at all. He listened. Almost every evening someone played the piano in the big house. He had discovered the fact a week before, and now when the dusk was gathering, he would watch his chance and slide away from the hut where his parents lived, and run fast up the hill and along the shelving roadway to the tall iron fence that marked the residence of Signore Barezzi. He would creep along under the stone wall, and crouching there would wait and listen for the music. Several evenings he had come and waited, and waited, and waited, and not a note or a voice did he hear. Once it had rained, and he didn't mind it much, for he expected every moment the music would strike up, you know, and who cares for cold or wet or even hunger if one can hear good music? The air grew chill, and the boy's threadbare jacket stuck to his bony form like a postage stamp to a letter. Little rivulets of water ran down his hair and streamed off his nose and cheeks. He waited. He was waiting for the music. He might have waited until the water dissolved his insignificant cosmos into just plain yellow mud, and then he would have been simply distributed all along the gutter down to the stream, and down the stream to the river, and down the river to the ocean, and no one would ever have heard of him again. But Signore Barezzi's coachman came along that night, keeping close to the fence under the trees to avoid the wet, and the coachman fell over the boy. Now, when we fall over anything, we always want to kick it, no matter what it is, be it cat, dog, stump, stick, stone, or human. The coachman, being but clay, undissolved, turned and kicked the boy. Then he seized him by the collar and accused him of being a thief. The lad acknowledged the indictment and stammeringly tried to explain that it was only music he was trying to steal, and that it really made no difference, because even if one did fill himself full of the music, there was just as much left for other people, since music was different from most things. The thought was not very well expressed, although the idea was all right, but the coachman failed to grasp it. So he tingled the boy's bare legs with the whip he carried, by way of answer, duly cautioning him never to let it occur again, and released the prisoner on parole. But the boy forgot, and came back the next night. He sat on the ground below the wall, intending to keep out of sight, but when the music began he stood up, and now with face pressed between the pickets he listened. The wind sighed softly through the orange trees, the air was heavy with the perfume of flowers. The low of cattle came from across the valley, and on the evening breeze from an open casement rose the strong, vibrant yet tender strains of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The lad listened. "Do you like music?" came a voice from behind. The boy awoke with a start, and tried to butt his head through the pickets to escape in that direction. He thought it was the coachman. He turned and saw the kindly face of Signore Barezzi himself. "Do I like music? Me? No, I mean yes, when it is like that," he exclaimed, beginning his reply with a tremolo, and finishing bravura. "That is my daughter playing. Come inside with me." The hand of the great man reached out, and the urchin clutched at it as if it were something he had been longing for. They walked through the big gates where a stone lion kept guard on each side. The lions never moved. They walked up the steps, and entering the parlor saw a young woman seated at the piano. "Grazia, dear. Here is the little boy we saw the other day. You remember. I thought I would bring him in." The young woman came forward and touched the lad on his tawny head with one of her beautiful hands, the beautiful hands that had just been playing this sonata. "That's right, little boy. We have seen you outside there before, and if I had known you were there tonight, I would have gone out and brought you in. But papa has done the service for me. Now you must sit down right over there where I can see you, and I will play for you. But won't you tell us your name?" "Me?" replied the little boy. Why, my name is Giuseppe Verdi. I am 10 years old now, going on 11. You see, I like to hear you play because I play myself a little bit." For over 100 years 3/4 of Italy's population had been on reduced rations. Starvation even yet crouches just around the corner. In his childhood young Verdi used to wear a bit of rope for a girdle, and when hunger gnawed importunately, he would simply pull his belt one knot tighter, and pray that the ravens would come and treat him as well as they did Elijah. His parents were so poor that the question of education never came to them. But desire had its way, so we find the boy at 10 years of age, running errands for a grocer with a musical attachment. This grocer at Busseto, Jasquith by name, hung upon the fringe of art, and made the dire mistake of mixing business with his fad, for he sold his wares to sundry gentlemen who played in bands. This led the good man to moralize at times, and he would say to Giuseppe, who had been promoted from errand boy to clerk, "You can trust a first violin, and a cello usually pays, but never say yes to a trombone nor an oboe, and as for a kettle drum, I wouldn't believe one on a stack of Bibles." Over the grocer's shop was a little parlor, and in it was a spinet that young Giuseppe had the use of 4 evenings a week. In his later years Verdi used to tell of this, and once said that the idea of prohibition and limit should be put on every piano, then the pupil would make the best of his privileges. In those days there was a tax on spinets, and I believe that this tax has never been rescinded, for you are taxed if you keep a piano now in any part of Italy. Several times the poor grocer's spinet stood in sore peril from the publicans and sinners, but the bailiffs were bought off by Signore Barezzi, who came to the rescue. The note of thrift was even then in Verdi's score, for he himself has told how he induced the Barezzi household to patronize the honest grocer with musical proclivities. When 12 years of age, Verdi occasionally played the organ in the village church at Busseto. It will be seen from this that he had courage, and even then possessed a trace of that pride and self-will that was to be his disadvantage and then his blessing. Signore Barezzi's attachment to the boy was very great, and we find the youngster was on friendly terms with the family, having free use of their piano, with valuable help and instruction from Signorina Grazia. When he was 17, he was easily the first musician in the place, and Busseto had nothing more to offer in the way of advantages. He thirsted for a wider career, and cast longing looks out into the great outside world. He had played at Parma, only a few miles away, and the bishop there, after hearing him improvise on the organ, had paid him a doubtful compliment by saying, "Your playing is surely unlike anything ever before heard in Parma." Fair fortune smiled when Signore Barezzi secured for young Verdi a free scholarship at the Conservatory at Milan. The youth went gaily forth, attended by the blessings of the whole village, to claim his honors. Arriving at the Conservatory, the directors put him through his paces, after the usual custom, to prove his fitness for the honor that had been thrust upon him. He played first upon the piano, and the committee advised together in whispered monotone. Then they asked him to play on the organ, and there was more consultation, with argument which was punctuated by rolling adjectives and many picturesque gesticulations. Then they asked him to play on the piano again. He did so, and the great men retired to deliberate and vote on the issue. Their decision was that the youth was self-willed, erratic, and that he had some absurd mannerisms and tricks of performance that forbade his ever making a musician, and therefore they ruled that his admission to the conservatory was impossible. Barezzi, who was present with his protégé, stormed in wrath, and declared that Verdi was the peer of any of his judges, in fact was so much beyond them that they could not comprehend him. This only confirms the powers in the stand they had taken, and they intimated that a great musician in Busseto was something different in Milan. Signore Barezzi had better take his young man home and be content to astonish the villagers with noisy acrobatics. There being nothing else to do, the advice was first flouted and then followed. They arrived home, and Grazia and the grocer were informed that the conservatory at Milan was a delusion and a snare, a place where pebbles were polished and diamonds were dimmed. Shortly after, the townspeople, to show faith in the home product, had Verdi duly installed as organist of the village church at a salary equal to $40 a year. Under the spell of this good fortune, Verdi proposed marriage to the daughter of Jasquith, the grocer, his friend and benefactor. Gratitude to the man who had first assisted him had much to do with the alliance, and in wedding the daughter, Verdi simply complied with what he knew to be the one ardent desire of the father. The girl was a frail creature of fine instincts, but her intellect had been starved, just as her body had been. Her chief virtue seems to have been that she believed absolutely in the genius of Verdi. The ambition of Verdi began to show itself. He wrote an opera, and offered it to Merelli, the impresario of La Scala at Milan. The impresario had heard of Verdi through the fact that the conservatory had blackballed him. This of itself would have been no passport to fame, but the committee saw fit to defend themselves in the matter by making a public report of the considerations which had moved them to shut the doors on the young man from Busseto. This gave the subject a weight and prominence that simple admission never would have given. Merelli, the major pond of Milan, saw the expressions bizarre, erratic, peculiar, unprecedented, and kept his eye on Verdi. And so, when the opera was written, he pounced upon it, thinking possibly a new star had appeared on the horizon. The opera was accepted. Verdi, feverish with hope, moved his scanty effects to Milan, and there with his frail and beautiful girl wife and their baby boy, lived in a garret just across from the theater. Preparations for the performance were going on apace. The night of November 17, 1839 came, and the play was presented. The critics voted it a failure. Merelli, the manager, saw that it was not strong enough with which to storm the town, and so decided to abandon it. He liked the young composer, though, and admired his work, and inasmuch as he had brought him to Milan, he felt a sort of obligation to help him along. So Verdi was given an order for an opera bouffe. That's it, opera bouffe. The people want comedy, they must be amused. Even Verdi's serious work ran dangerously close to farce. Bouffe is the thing. Merelli's hope was infectious. Verdi began work on the new play that was to be presented in the spring. The winter rains began. There was no fire in the garret where the composer and his frail girl wife lived. They were so proud that they did not let the folks at Busseto know where they were. Even Merelli did not know their place of abode. Under an assumed name, Verdi got occasional work as an underling in one of the theaters, and also played the piano at a restaurant. The wages thus earned were a pittance, but he managed to take home soup bones that the baby boy sucked on as though they were nectar. Another baby was born that winter. The mother was unattended save by her husband. No other woman was near. Verdi managed to bring home scraps of food by stealth from the restaurant where he played, but it was not the kind that was needed. There was no money to buy goat's milk for the newborn babe, and the famishing mother, ever hopeful, assured the husband that it wasn't necessary, that the babe was doing well. The child grew aweary of this world before a month had passed and slept to wake no more. But the opera bouffe was taking shape. It was rehearsed and hummed by husband and wife together. They went over it all again and again, and struck out and added to. It was splendid work, subtle, excruciatingly funny, and possessed a dash and go that would sweep all carping and criticism before it. Food was still scarce, and there was no fuel even to cook things, but as there was nothing to cook, it really made no difference. Spring was coming. It was cold, to be sure, but the buds were swelling on the trees in the park. Verdi had seen them with his own eyes, and he hastened home to tell his wife. Spring was coming. The 2-year-old boy didn't seem to thrive on soup bones. The father used to hold him in his arms at night to warm the little form against his own body. He awoke one morning to find the child cold and stiff. The boy was dead. The mother used to lie abed all day now. She wasn't ill, she said, just tired. She never looked so beautiful to her husband. 2 bright pink spots marked her cheeks and set off the alabaster of her complexion. Her eyes glowed with such a light as Verdi had never before seen. No, she was not ill. She protested this again and again. She kept to her bed merely to be warm, and then if one didn't move around much, less food was required, don't you see? Spring had come. The opera was being rehearsed. The title of the play was Un giorno di regno. Merelli said he thought it would be a success. Verdi was sure of it. The night of presentation came. After the first act, Verdi ran across the street, leaped up the stairs 3 steps at a time, and reached the garret. The play was a success. The worn woman there on her pallet, the pale moonlight streaming in on her face, knew it would be. She raised herself on her elbow and tried to call, "Viva Verdi!" But the cough cut her words short. Verdi kissed her forehead, her hands, her hair, and hurried back in time to see the curtain ascend on the second act. This act went without either applause or disapproval. Verdi ran home to say that the audience was a trifle critical, but the play was all right, it was a success. He said he would remain at home now. He would not go to hear the third and last act. He would attend to his wife until she got well and strong. The play was a success. She prevailed upon him to leave her and then come back at the finale and tell her all about it. He went away. When he returned, he stumbled up the stairway and slowly entered the door. The last act had not been completed. The audience had hissed the players from the stage. Upon the ashen face of her husband the stricken woman read all. She tried to smile. She reached out one thin hand on which loosely hung a marriage ring. The hand dropped before he could reach it. The eyes of the woman were closed, but upon the long black lashes glistened 2 big tears. The spirit was brave, but the body had given up the great struggle. End of section 19. Section 20 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.L. Baldwin. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard, Chapter 10, Part 2. The calamities that had come sweeping over Verdi well nigh broke his proud heart. He was only 26, but he had had a taste of life and found it bitter. He lost interest in everything. All his musical studies were abandoned, his excursions into science went by default, and he was quite content to bang the piano in a concert saloon for enough to secure the bare necessaries of life. Suicide seemed to present the best method of solving the problem, and the various ways of shuffling off this mortal coil were duly considered. Meanwhile, he filled in the time reading trashy novels, anything to forget time and place and lose self in poppy dreams of nothingness. 2 years of such blankness and blackness followed. He was sure that the desire to create, to be, to do would never come again. These were all of the past. One day, on an idle stroll through the park, he met Merelli. As they walked along together, Merelli took from his pocket a book, The Story of Nabucco, and handing it to Verdi, asked him to look it over, and see if he thought there was a chance to make an opera out of it. Verdi responded that he was not in the business of writing operas. He had quit all such follies. He took the volume, however, but neglected to look at it for several days. At last he read the pages. He laid the book down and began to pace the floor. Possibilities of creation were looming large before him. A rush of thought was upon him. His soul was not dead. It had only been lying fallow. He secured the loan of a piano and set to work. In a month the opera was completed. Merelli hesitated about accepting it. Twice he had lost money on Verdi. Finally he decided he would put the play on if Verdi would waive all royalties for the first 3 performances, if it were a success, and then sell the opera outright at a reasonable price, if Merelli should chance to want it. The reasonable price was assumed to be about 1,000 francs, $200. Pretty good pay for a month's work. Verdi took no interest in the production of the piece. He had come to the conclusion that the public was a fickle, foolish thing, and no one could tell what it would hiss or applaud. Then he remembered the blackness of the night when only 2 years before his other opera was produced. He made his way to his dingy little room and went to bed. Very early the next morning there was a loud pounding on his door. It was Merelli. "How much for your opera?" asked the impresario, pushing his way into the room. 30,000 francs, came a voice, loud and clear out of the bedclothes. "Don't be a fool," returned Merelli. "Why do you ask such a sum?" "Because you are here at 5 o'clock in the morning. The price will be 50,000 this afternoon." 10 minutes of parley followed, and then Merelli drew his check for 20,000 francs, and Verdi gave his quitclaim, turned over in bed, and went to sleep again. The success of Nabucodonosor was complete. Its author had his 20,000 francs, but Merelli made more than that. From 1842 to 1851 may be called the first Verdi period. A dozen successful operas were produced, and simultaneously at Rome, Naples, Venice, Milan, Genoa, and Florence, Verdi's compositions were being presented. The master was a businessman as well as an artist. The combination is not so unusual as was long believed, and knew how to get the most for the mintage of his mind. Money fairly flowed his way. Verdi married again in 1850. His life now turns into what may be called the second Verdi period. After this we shall see no more such curious exhibitions of bad taste as a ballet of 40 witches in Macbeth, capering nimbly to a syncopated melody, with Lady Macbeth in a needlessly abbreviated skirt singing a drinking song to an absent lover. In strenuous efforts to avoid coarseness, Verdi may occasionally give us soft sentimentality, but the change is for the best. His mate was a woman of mind as well as heart. She was his intellectual companion, his friend, his wife. For nearly 50 years they lived together. Her dust now lies in the House of Rest at Milan, a home for aged artists founded by Verdi. This House of Rest was a love offering, dedicated to the woman who had given him without stint of the richness of her nature, who had bestowed rest and peace and hope and gentle love. She had no feverish ambitions and petty plans and schemes for secretly corralling pleasure, power, place, attention, or selfish admiration. By giving all, she won all. She devoted herself to this man in whom she had perfect faith, and he had perfect faith in her. She ministered to him. They grew great together. When each was over 80 years of age, Henry James met them at Cremona, at a musical festival in honor of the birthday of Stradivari. And thus wrote Henry James: "Verdi and his wife were there, admired above all others." And why not? Think of whom they are, and what they stand for. Nearly a century of music and a century of life. The master is tall, straight, proud, commanding. He has a courtly, old-time grace of bearing, and he kissed his wife's hand when he took leave of her for an hour's stroll. And the madame surely is not old in spirit. She is as sprightly as our own Mrs. John Sherwood, who translated Carcassonne so well that she improved on the original, because in her heart spring fresh and fragrant every day the flowers of tender, human, godlike sympathy. Rigoletto, produced in the year 1851 at Venice, is founded on Victor Hugo's Le Roi s'amuse, and the music has all the dramatic fire that matches the Hugo plot. Verdi's devotion to Victor Hugo is seen again in the use of Ernani for operatic purposes. Il Trovatore and La Traviata followed Rigoletto, and these 3 operas are usually put forward as the Verdi masterpieces. The composer himself regarded them with a favor that may well be pardoned, since he used to say that he and his wife collaborated in their production, she writing the music and he looking on. The proportion of truth and poetry in this statement is not on record. But the simple fact remains that Il Trovatore was always a favorite with Verdi, and even down to his death he would travel long distances to hear it played. A correspondent of the Musical Courier, writing from Paris in 1887, says: "Verdi and his wife occupied a box last evening at the Grand Opera House. The piece was Il Trovatore, and many smiles were caused by the sight of the author and his spouse seemingly leading the claque as if they would split their gloves." The flaming forth of creative genius that produced the Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, and La Traviata subsided into a placid calm. The serene happiness of Verdi's married life, the fortune that had come to him, and the consciousness of having won in spite of great obstacles, led him to the thought of quiet and well-earned rest. The master interested himself in politics, and was elected to represent the district of Parma in the Italian Parliament. He proved himself a man of power, practical, self-centered, and businesslike, and as such served his country well. The sentiment of the man is shown in his buying the property at Busseto, his old home, which was owned by Signore Barezzi. He removed the high picket fence, replacing it with a low stone wall, remodeled the house, and turned the conservatory into a small theater, where free concerts were often given with the help of the villagers. The adjoining grounds and the splendid park were free to the public. The master's attention to music was now limited to enjoying it. So passed the days. 10 years of the life of a country gentleman went by, and the Shah of Persia, who had been on a visit to Italy and met Verdi, sent a command for an opera. The plot must be laid in the East, the characters Moorish, and the whole to be dedicated to the immortal son of the sun, the Shah. It is a little doubtful whether the Shah knew that operas are produced only in certain moods and cannot be done to order as a carpenter builds a fence. But it was the way that Eastern royalty had of showing its high esteem. Verdi smiled, and his wife smiled, and they had quite a merry little time over the matter, calling in the neighbors and friends, and drinking to the health of a real live Shah, who knew a great musical genius when he found one. But suddenly the matter began to take form in the master's mind. He set to work, and the result was that in a few weeks Aida was completed. The stories often told of the long preparation for composing this opera reveal the fine imagination of the men who write for the newspapers. Verdi seized upon knowledge as a devilfish absorbs its prey. He learned in the mass. Aida was first produced at Cairo in 1871 with a grand setting and the best cast procurable. A new Verdi opera was an event, and critics went from London, Paris, and other capitals to see the performance. The first thing the knowing ones said was that Verdi was touched with Wagnerism, and that he had studied Lohengrin with painstaking care. If Verdi was influenced by Wagner, it was for good, but there was no servile imitation in it. The Aida is rich in melody, reveals a fine balance between singers and orchestra, and the local color is correct even to the chorus of Congo slaves that was introduced at the performance in Cairo. All agreed that the rest had done the master good, and the correspondents wrote, "We will look anxiously for his next." They thought the stream had started, and there would be an overflow. But they were mistaken. 16 years of quiet farming followed. Verdi was more interested in his flowers than his music, and told Philip Hale, who made a pious pilgrimage to Busseto in 1883, that he loved his horses more than all the prima donnas on earth. But in 1887 the artistic and music-loving world was surprised and delighted with Otello. This grand performance made amends for the mangling of Macbeth. James Huneker says, "The character drawing in Otello is done with the burin of a master. The plot moves in processional splendor, the musical psychology is subtle and inevitable. At last the genius of Verdi has flowered, the work is consummate and complete." Falstaff came next, written by a gray beard of 80, as if just to prove that the heart does not grow old. It is the work of an octogenarian who loved life and had seen the world of show and sense from every side. Old men usually moralize and live in the past. Not so here. The play flows with a laughing, joyous, rippling quality that disarmed the critics, and they apologized for what they had said about Wagnerian motives. There were no sad, solemn, recurring themes in the full-ripened fruit of Verdi's genius. When he died at the age of 87, the curtain fell on the career of a great and potent personality, the one unique singer of the 19th century. End of section 20.
Section 21 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 11, Part 1. Wolfgang Mozart. Wolfgang Mozart. Apology. The Mozart Little Journey was written, and as over a month had been taken to do the task, the result was something of which I was justly proud. It was quite unlike anything ever before written. The printers were ready to take the work in hand, but I begged them to allow me 2 more days for careful revision, and as I was just starting away to give a lecture at Janesville, Wisconsin, I took the manuscript with me, intending to do the final work of revision on the train. All went well on the journey. The lecture had been given with no special tokens of disapproval on part of the audience, and was on board the early morning train that leaves for Chicago. And as my mind is usually fairly clear in the early hours, I began work retouching the good manuscript. We were nearing Beloit when I bethought me to go into the buffet car for a moment. When I returned, the manuscript was not to be seen. I looked in various seats and under the seats, asked my neighbors, inquired of the brakeman, and then hunted up the porter and asked him if he'd seen my manuscript. He did not at first understand what I meant by the term manuscript, but finally inquired if I referred to a pile of dirty dog-eared sheets of paper, all marked up and down and over and crisscross every which way. I assured him that he understood the case. He then informed me that he had chucked the stuff, that is to say, he had tossed it out of the window, as he was cleaning up his car, just as he always did before reaching Chicago. I made a frantic reach for the bell cord, but was restrained. A sympathetic passenger came forward and explained that 5 miles back he had seen the sheets of my precious manuscript sailing across the prairie. We were going at the rate of a mile a minute, and the wind was blowing fiercely, so there was really no need of backing up the train to regain the lost goods. "I hope dem scribbled papers was no count, boss," said the porter humbly, as I stood sort of dazed, gazing into vacancy. I shook myself into partial sanity. "Oh, they were of no value. I was looking for them so as to throw them out of the window myself," I answered. "Brush?" said he. "Yes," said I. I placed the expected quarter in his dusky palm, still pondering on what I should do. To reproduce the matter was impossible, for I have no verbal memory. Something must be written, though. I decided to leave Chicago in an hour by the Lake Shore Railroad, and have the copy ready for the Roycroft boys when I reached home. This I did, and as I had no reference books, maps, or memoranda to guide me, the matter seems to lack synthesis. I say seems to lack, but it really doesn't, for the facts will all be found to be as stated. Still, the form may be said to be slightly colored by the environment, so some explanation is in order. Hence this apology to the gentle reader. And further, if the reader should find in these pages that at rare intervals I use the personal pronoun, he must bear in mind that I live in the country, and that is the privilege and right established by long precedence and custom of country folk, to talk about themselves and their own affairs if they are so minded. Chicago. Talent is usually purchased at a high price, and if the gods give you a generous supply of this, they probably will be niggardly when it comes to that. But one thing the artist is usually long on, and that is whim. Let us all pray to be delivered from whim. It is the poisoner of our joys, the corrupter of our peace, and Dead Sea fruit for all those about us. Heaven deliver us from whim. I am told by a famous impresario, who gained some valuable experience by marrying a prima donna, and therefore should know, that whim is purely a feminine attribute. This, though, is surely a mistake, for there have lived men as well as women who have had an exaggerated sense of their own worth, that they lost sight entirely of the rights and feelings of everybody else. All through life they kept the stage waiting without punctilio. These men thought dogs were made to kick, servants to rail at, the public to be first crawled to and then damned, and all rivals to be pooh-poohed, cursed, or feared, as the mood might prompt. Further than this, they considered all landlords robbers, every railroad manager a rogue, and businessmen they bunched as greedy, grasping Shylocks. They always used the word commercial as an epithet. Devotees of the histrionic art can lay just claim to having more than their share of whim, but the musical profession has no reason to be abashed, for it is a good second. However, the actors and the musicians' art are often not far separated. In speaking to James McNeill Whistler of a certain versatile musician, a lady once said, "I believe he also acts." "Madame, he does nothing else," replied Mr. Whistler. Art is not a thing separate and apart. Art is only the beautiful way of doing things. And is it not most absurd to think, because a man has the faculty of doing a thing well, that on his account he should assume airs and declare himself exempt along the line of morals and manners? The expression artistic temperament is often an apologetic term, like literary sensitiveness, which means that the man has stuck to one task so long that he is unable to meet his brother men on a respectful equality. The artist is the voluptuary of labor, and his fantastic tricks often seem to be only nature's way of equalizing matters, and showing the world that he is very common clay after all. To be modest and gentle and kind, as we all can be, is just as much to God as to be learned and talented, and yet to be a cad. Still, instances of great talent and becoming modesty are sometimes found, and in no great musician was the balance of virtues held more gracefully than with Mozart. He had humor. Ah, that is it, he knew values, had a sense of proportion, and realized that there is a time to laugh. And a good time to laugh is when you see a mighty bundle of pretense and affectation coming down the street. Dignity is the mask behind which we hide our ignorance, and our forced dignity is what makes the imps of comedy, who sit aloft in the sky, hold their sides in merriment when they behold us demanding obseisance because we've fallen heir to tuppence worth of talent. Laporte. Mozart had a sense of humor. He knew a big thing from a little one. When yet a child, the tendency to comedy was strong upon him. When 9 years of age, he once played at a private musicale where the Empress Maria Theresa was present. The lad even then was a consummate violinist. He had just played a piece that contained such a tender, mournful minor strain that several of the ladies were in tears. The boy, seeing this, relentingly dashed off into a barnyard symphony, where donkeys brayed, hens cackled, pigs squealed, and cows mooed, all ending with a terrific cat fight on a woodshed roof. This done, the boy threw his violin down, ran across the room, climbed into the lap of the Empress, and throwing his arms around the neck of the good lady, kissed her a resounding smack first on one cheek, then on the other. It was all very much like that performance of Liszt, who one day, when he was playing the piano, suddenly shouted, "Pitch everything out of the windows!" and then proceeded to do it, on the keyboard, of course. On the same visit to the palace, when Mozart saluted Maria Theresa in his playful way, he had the misfortune to slip and fall on the waxed floor. Marie Antoinette, daughter of Maria Theresa, just budding into womanhood, ran and picked him up and rubbed his knee where it was hurt. "You are a dear good lady," said the boy in gratitude, "and when I grow up I'm going to marry you." Liszt never made any such promise as that. Liszt never offered to marry anybody. But it is too bad that Marie Antoinette did not hold the lad to his promise. It would have probably proved a valuable factor for her in the line of longevity, and her husband's circumstances would have saved her from making that silly inquiry as to why poor people don't eat cake when they run short of bread. These moods of merriment continued with Mozart, as they did with Liszt all his life, not always manifesting themselves, though, in the way just described. As a companion I would choose Mozart, generous, unaffected, kind, rather than any other musician who ever played, danced, sang, or composed, excepting, well, say, Brahms. South Bend. We take an interest in the lives of others, because we always, when we think of another, imagine our relationship to him. Had I met Shakespeare on the stairs, I would have fainted dead away, said Thackeray. Another reason why we are interested in biography is because, to a degree, it is a repetition of our own life. There are certain things that happen to everyone, and others we think might have happened to us, and may yet. So as we read, we unconsciously slip into the life of the other man and confuse our identity with his. To put yourself in his place is the only way to understand and appreciate him. It is imagination that gives us this faculty of transmigration of souls, and to have imagination is to be universal, not to have it is to be provincial. Let me see. Wouldn't you rather be a citizen of the universe than a citizen of Peoria, Illinois, which modest town the actors always speak of as being one of the provinces? As I read biography, I always keep thinking what I would have done in certain described circumstances, and so not only am I living the other man's life, but I am comparing my nature with his. Everything is comparative. That is the only way we realize anything, by comparing it with something else. As you read of the great man, he seems very near to you. You reach out across the years and touch hands with him, and with him you hope, suffer, strive, and enjoy. Your existence is all blurred and fused with his. And through this oneness you come to know and comprehend a character that has once existed, very much better than the people did who lived in his day and were blind to his true worth by being ensnared in cliques that were in competition with him. I intimated a few pages back that I would have liked to have Mozart for a friend and companion. Mozart needed me no less than I need him. Genius needs a keeper, once said I. Zangwill, probably with himself in mind. We all need friends, and to be your brother's keeper is very excellent if you do not cease being his friend. And poor Mozart did so need a friend who could stand between him and the rapacious wolf that scratched and sniffed at his door as long as he lived. I do not know why the wolf sniffed, for Mozart never really had anything worth carrying away. He was so generous that his purse was always open, and so full of unmixed pity that the beggars passed his name along and made cabalistic marks on his gate-posts. Every seedy, needy, thirsty, and ill-appreciated musician in Germany regarded him as lawful prey. They used to say to Mozart, "I cannot beg, and to dig I am ashamed, so grant me a small loan, I pray thee." Yes, Mozart needed me to plan his tours and market his wares. I'm no genius, and although they say I was an infant terrible, I never was an infant prodigy. At the tender age of 6, Mozart was giving concerts and astonishing Europe with his subtle skill. At a like age I could catch a horse with a nubbin, climb his back, and without a saddle or bridle drive him wherever I listed by the judicious use of a tattered hat. Of course I took pains to mount only a horse that had arrived at years of discretion, matronly brood mares or run-down plough horses, but this is only proof of my practical turn of mind. Mozart never learned how to control either horse or man by means of a tattered hat or diplomacy. Music was his hobby, and it was long years after his death before the world discovered that his hobby was no hobby at all, but a genuine automobile that carried him miles and miles, clear beyond all his competitors, so far ahead that he really was out of shouting distance. Indeed, Mozart took such an early start in life and drove his machinery so steadily, not to say so furiously, that at 35 all the bearings grew hot for lack of rebabbiting, and the vehicle went the way of the one-horse shay. All at once and nothing first, just as bubbles do when they burst. At the age at which Mozart died, I had seen all I wanted to of business life. In fact, I had made a fortune, being the only man in America who had all the money he wanted, and so just turned about and went to college. This I firmly hold is a better way than to be sent to college, and then go into trade later and forget all you ever learned at school. I had rather go to college than be sent. Every man should be rich, that he might know the worthlessness of riches, and every man should have a college education just to realize how little the thing is worth. Yes, Mozart needed a good friend whose abilities could be rounded out and made good his deficiencies. Most certainly I could not do the things that he did, but I should have been his helper, and might, too, had not a century, one wide ocean, and a foreign language separated us. Waterloo. Friendship is better than love for a steady diet. Suspicion, jealousy, prejudice, and strife follow in the wake of love, and disgrace, murder, and suicide lurk just around the corner from where love coos. Love is a matter of propinquity. It makes demands, asks for proofs, requires a token. But friendship seeks no ownership. It only hopes to serve, and it grows by giving. Do not say, please, that this applies also to love. Love bestows only that it may receive, and a one-sided passion turns to hate in a night, and then demands vengeance as its right and portion. Friendship asks no rash promises, demands no foolish vows, is strongest in absence, and is most loyal when needed. It lends ballast to life, and gives steadily to every venture. Through our friends we are made brothers to all who live. I think I would have rather had Mozart for a friend than to love and be loved by the greatest prima donna who ever warbled in high C. Friendship is better than love. Friendship means calm, sweet sleep, clear brain, and a strong hand on sanity. Love, I am told, is only friendship plus something else. But that something else is a great disturber of the peace, not to say digestion. It sometimes racks the brain until the world reels. Love is such a task on the emotions that this way madness lies. Friendship never led to suicide. End of section 21. Section 22 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 11, Part 2. Wolfgang Mozart. Toledo. Yes, just at the age when Mozart wrote and played his Requiem, getting ready to die, I was going to school and incidentally falling in love. I was 34 and shaved clean because there were gray hairs coming in my beard. Love has its advantages, of course, and the benefits of passionate love consist in scarifying one's sensibilities until they are raw, thus making one able to sympathize with those who suffer. Love sounds the feelings with a leaden plummet that sinks to the very depths of one's soul. This once done, the emotions can return with ease, and so this is why no singer can sing, or painter paint, or sculptor model, or writer write, until love or calamity, often the same thing, has sounded the depths of his soul. Love makes us wise because it makes room inside the soul for thoughts and feelings to germinate, but passionate love as a lasting mood would be hell. Henry Fink says that is why nature has fixed a 2-year limit on romantic or passionate love. War is hell, said General Sherman. All is fair in love and war, says the old proverb. Love and war are one, say I. Love is mad, raging unrest, and a vain hot, reaching out for nobody knows what. Of course, the kind which I am talking about is the grand passion, not the sort of sentiment that one entertains towards his grandmother. But it is good to fall in love, just as it is well to have measles, to quote Schopenhauer. Still there is difference. One only has the measles once, but the man who is loved is never immune, and no amount of pledges or resolves can e'er avail. Just here seems a good place to express a regret that the English language is such a crude affair that we use the same word to express a man's regard for roast beef, his dog, child, wife, and deity. There are those who speedily cry "hold" when one attempts to improve on the language, but I now give notice that on the first rainy day I am going to create some distinctions and differentiate for posterity along the line just mentioned. Illyria. As intimated in a former chapter, I was a successful farmer before I went to college. I was also a manufacturer and made a success in this business too. I made a fortune of $100,000 before I was 30, and should have it yet had I sat down and watched it. If you go into a railroad car and sit down by the side of your valise or manuscript, in an hour your valuables will probably be there all right. But if you leave the valise, or the manuscript, in a seat, and go into another car, when you come back the goods may be there and they may not. That is the only way to keep money. Fasten your eye right on it. If you leave it in the hands of others, and go away to delve in books, the probabilities are that, when you get back, certain obese attorneys have divided your substance among them. However, there is good in every exigency of life, and to know that your fortune is gone is a great relief. When the trial is ended and the prisoner has received his sentence, he feels a great relief, for it is only the unknown that fills our souls with apprehension. Cleveland. In all the realm of artistic history, no record of such extremes can be found in one life as those seen in the life of Mozart. The nearest approach to it is found in the career of Rembrandt, who won fame and fortune at 30, and then holding the pennant high for 10 years, his powers began to decline. It took 26 years of steady downgrade to ditch his destinies in a pauper's grave. But Rembrandt, during his lifetime, was scarcely known out of Holland, whereas Mozart not only won the nod of nobility and the favor of the highest in his own land, but he went into the enemy's country and captured Italy. Mozart art never languished. He held a firm grip on sublime verities right in the day of his death. The high water mark in Mozart's career was reached in those 2 years in Italy, when in his 13th and 14th years. The arts all go hand in hand, for the reason that strong men inspire strong men, and each does what he can do best. In painting, sculpture, and music, not to mention Antonio's Stradivari of Cremona, Italy has led the world. 100 years ago no musician could hope for the world's acclaim until Italy had placed its stamp of approval upon him. Savants in Milan, Florence, Padua, Rome, Verona, Venice, and Naples tested the powers of young Mozart to their fullest, and although he had to overcome doubt and the prejudice arising from being a barbaric German, yet the highest honors were at the last ungrudgingly paid him. He was enrolled as an honorary member of numerous musical societies. Old musicians gave their blessings, proud ladies craved their privilege of kissing his fair forehead, and the Pope conferred upon the gifted boy the Order of the Golden Spur, which gave him the right to have his mail come directed to the Signor Cavaliere Mozarti. At Naples the result of his marvellous playing was ascribed to enchantment, and this was thought to be centred in a diamond ring that had been presented to the lad by a fair lady in a mood of ecstasy. To convince the Neapolitans of their error, Mozart was obliged to accept their challenge and remove the ring. He wrote home to his mother that he had no time to practice, as in every city where he went artists insisted on his sitting for his portrait. The acme of attention and applause was reached at Milan, where he was commissioned to write an opera for the Christmas festivities. The production of this opera at La Scala was the most glorious item in the life of Mozart. A boy of 14 conducting an opera of his own composition before enraptured multitudes is an event that stands to the credit of Mozart, and Mozart alone. "Evviva the little master! Evviva the little master!" cried the audience. "It is music for the stars!" And against all precedent, aria after aria had to be repeated. The boy, always rather small for his age, stood on a chair to wield his baton, and the flowers that were rained upon him nearly covered the lad from view. Ashtabula. The place of a man's birth does not honour him until after he is dead, and every man of genius has been distrusted by his intimate kinsmen. If he is granted recognition by the outside world, those who have known him from childhood wink slyly and repeat Phineas T. Barnum's aphorism, a free paraphrase of which the Germans have used since the days of the Vandals. Leopold Mozart returned home with his wonderful boy not much richer than when he went away. He had left the management of finances to others, and was quite content to travel in a special carriage, stop at the best hotels, and have any label he might order just for the asking. Reports had reached Germany of the wonderful success of the youthful Mozart in Italy, but Vienna smiled and Salzburg sneezed. Northeast. It is not so very long ago that all the beautiful things of earth were supposed to belong to the superior class. That is to say, all the toilers, all the workers in metals, all the bookmakers, authors, poets, painters, sculptors, and musicians, did their work to please this noble or that. All bands of singers were singers to his lordship, and if a man wrote a book, he dedicated it to his royal highness. At first these thinkers and doers were veritable slaves, and no court was complete that did not have its wise man who wore the cap and bells, and made puns, epigrams, and quoted wise saws and modern instances for his board and keep. This man usually served as a clerk or overseer during his odd hours, and only appeared to give a taste of his quality when he was sent for. It was the same with the musicians and singers. They were cooks, waiters, and valets, and when there were guests these performers were notified to be in readiness, do something if called upon. It was the same with painters. Every court had his own. Rubens, as we know, was looked upon by the Duke of Mantua as his private property, and the artist had to run away when the time was ripe to save his soul alive. Van Dyck was court painter to Charles I, and married when he was told to do so. There is no such office as Poet Laureate of England. The laureate is poet to the king, and used to dine with the master of the hounds. Later he was allowed to choose his domicile and live in his own house, like St. Paul, the prisoner at Rome. Silver Creek. Leopold Mozart and the son who caused his name to endure were in the employ of the Archbishop of Salzburg. The Archbishop was a veritable prince, with short breath and a double chin, and no shade of doubt ever came to him concerning the divinity of his succession. He ruled by divine right, and everybody and everything were made to minister to the well-being of his person and estate. The Mozarts were too poor to escape from the employ of the Archbishop, and he took pains to warn all interested persons not to harbor, encourage, or entice his servants away on penalty of dire displeasure. Mozart ate with the servants, and we have his letters written to his sister, showing how his seat was next below that of the coachman. When he was to play before invited guests, he was made to wait in the entry until the footman called him, and there he often stood for hours, first on one foot, then on t'other. It is easy to ask why a man of such sublime talent should endure such treatment. But the simple fact is, Mozart was gentle, yielding, kind, immersed in his music, with no power to set his will against the tide of tendency that compassed him round. The Archbishop forbade his playing at concerts or entertainments, and blocked the way to all advancement. The Archbishop didn't have a diplomat like Rubens to cope with, or a fighter like Wagner, or a plotter like Liszt, or a stiletto-bearing man like Paganini, and so Mozart wrote his music on a table in one corner of a beer garden, and waltzed with his wife Constance to keep warm when there was no fire and the weather was cold, and all the time danced attendance on the Archbishop of Salzburg. All of his feeble, spasmodic efforts at freedom came to naught, because there was no persistency behind them. Gladly would he have sold his services for 300 gulden a year, but even this sum, equal to $150 a year, was denied him. He was always composing, always making plans, always seeing the silver tint in the clouds. But all of his music was taken by this one or that in whom he foolishly trusted, and only debt and humiliation followed him. When at long intervals a sum would come his way from a generous admirer touched with pity, all the beggars in the neighborhood seemed to know it at once. Then it was that music filled the air at the beer garden. Carking care and unkind fate were for the time forgot, and all went merry as a wedding bell. Finally, the position of court musician to the Emperor of Austria fell vacant, and certain good friends of Mozart secured him the place. But the Emperor was not like Frederick the Great, for he could not distinguish one time from another, and did not consider it any special virtue so to do. The result was that his musicians were looked after by his valet, and Mozart found that his position was really no better than it had been with the Archbishop of Salzburg. And still his mind proved infirm of purpose, and he had not the courage to demand his right, for fear he might lose even the little that he had. Buffalo. Mozart was in his 20th year when he met Eloisa Weber. She was a gifted singer, surely, and was needlessly healthy. She was of that peculiar, heartless type that finds digression in leading men a merry chase and then flaunting and flouting them. Young Mozart, the impressionable, Mozart the delicate and sensitive, Mozart the Aeolian harp, played upon by every passing breeze, loved this bouncing bundle of pink and white tyranny. She encouraged the passion, and it gradually grew until it absorbed the boy, and he grew oblivious to all else. He lived in her smile, bathed in the sunshine of her presence, fed on her words, and as for her singing in opera, it was not so much what her voice was now, but what he was sure it would be. His glowing imagination made good her every deficiency. He thought he loved the girl. It was not the girl at all he loved. He only loved the ideal that existed in his own heart. His father opposed the mating and hastily transferred the youth from Vienna to Paris. But whoever heard of opposition and argument and forced separation curing love? So matters ran on, and letters and messages passed, and finally Mozart made his way back to Vienna, and with breathless haste sought out the object of his whole heart's love. She had recently met a man she liked better, and as she could not hold them both, treated Mozart as a stranger and froze him to the marrow. He was crushed, undone, and a fit of sickness followed. In his illness, Constance, a younger sister of Eloisa, came to him in pity and nursed him as a child. Very naturally, all the love he had felt for Eloisa was easily and readily transferred to Constance. The tendrils of the heart, ruthlessly uprooted, cling to the first object that presents itself. And so Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Constance Weber were married, and they were happy ever afterward. It would have been much better if they had quarreled, but Mozart's gentle, yielding character readily adapted itself to the weaker nature of his wife. In his music she took a sort of blind and deaf delight, and guessed its greatness because she loved the man. But when two weak wills combine, the net result is increased weakness, never strength. Constance was as beautiful a specimen of the slipshod housekeeper as ever piled away breakfast dishes unwashed, or swept dirt under a settee. If they had money, she bought things they did not need, and if there was no money, she borrowed provisions and forgot to return the loan. Irregularity of living, deprivation and hope deferred, made the woman ill, and she became a chronic sufferer. But she was ever tended with loving, patient care by the overburdened and underfed husband. A biographer tells how Mozart would often arise early in the morning to set down some melody and music that he had dreamed out during the night. On such occasions he would leave a little love letter for his wife on the stand at the head of the bed, where she would find it on first awakening. One such note, freely translated, runs as follows: "Good morning, dear little wife. I hope you rested well and had sweet dreams. You were sleeping so peacefully that I dare not kiss your cheek for fear of disturbing you. It is a beautiful morning, and a bird outside is singing a song that is in my heart. I am going out to catch the strain and write it down as my own and yours. I shall be back in an hour." Last Aurora. Elosia married the man of her choice, an actor by the name of Lange. They quarrelled right shortly, and soon he used to beat her. This was endured for a year or more, then she left him. For a while she lived with Wolfgang and Constance, and Mozart, true to his nature, gave her from his own scanty store, and deprived himself for her benefit. He stood godfather to one of her children, and was a true friend to her to the last. After Aloysia lived to be an old woman, and long after Mozart had passed out, and the world had begun to utter his praises, she said, "I never for a moment thought he was a genius. I always considered him just a nice little man." Mozart's soul was filled with melody, and all of his music is faultless and complete. He possessed the artistic conscience to a degree that is unique. Careless and heedless in all else, if his mood was not right and the product was halting, he straightway destroyed the score. He was always at work, always hearing sweet sounds, always weighing and balancing them in the delicate scales of his judgment. So absorbed was he in his art that he fell an easy victim to the designing, and never stopped his work long enough to strike off the shackles that bound him to a vain, selfish, and unappreciative court. Worn by constant work, worried by his wife's continued illness, dogged by creditors, and unable to get justice from those who owed it to him, his nerves at the early age of 35 gave way. His vitality rapidly declined, and at last went out as a candle does when blown upon by a sudden gust from an open door. It was a blustering winter day in December, 1791, when his burial occurred. A little company of friends assembled, but no funeral dirge was played for him, save the blasts blown through the naked branches of the trees, as they hurried the plain pine coffin to its final resting place. At the gate of the cemetery the few friends turned back and left the lifeless clay to the old gravedigger, who never guessed the honor thus done him. It was a pauper's grave that closed over the body of Mozart, coffin piling on coffin, and no one marked the spot. All we know is that somewhere in St. Mark's Cemetery, Vienna, was buried in a trench the most accomplished composer and performer the world has ever known. It was 100 years afterwards before the city made tardy amends by erecting a fitting monument to his memory. His best monument is his work. The melody that once filled his soul is yours and mine, for by his art he made us heirs to all the wealth of love that was never requited, and the dreams that for him never came true are our precious and priceless legacy. End of section 22.
Section 23 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maggie Travers. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 12. Johannes Brahms, Part 1. What is music? This question occupied my mind for hours last night before I fell asleep. The very existence of music is wonderful, I might even say miraculous. Its domain is between thought and phenomena. Like a twilight mediator, It hovers between spirit and matter, related to both, yet differing from each. It is spirit, but spirit subject to the measurement of time. It is matter, but matter that can dispense with space. Heine. Emerson has said that, next to the man who first voices a great truth, is the one who quotes it. Truth is in the air. It belongs to all who can appreciate it, and the difference between the man who gives a truth expression and the listener who at once comprehends and repeats it is very slight. If you understand what I say, it is because you have thought the same thoughts yourself. I merely express for you that which you already know. And so you approve and applaud, not stopping to think that you are applauding your own thought, and your heart beats fast and you say, "Yes, yes, why didn't I say that myself?" All conversation is a sort of communion, an echoing back and forth of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. We clarify our thoughts by expressing them. No idea is quite your own until you tell it to another. Music is simply one form of expression. Its province is to impart a sublime emotion. To give himself is the controlling impulse in the heart of every artist. To impart to others the joy he feels, this is the dominant motive in his life. Hence the poet writes, the artist paints, the sculptor models, the singer sings, the musician plays. All is expression, a giving voice to the silence. But it is all done for others. In ministering to others, the artist ministers to himself. In helping others, we help ourselves. We grow strong through exercise, and only the faculties that are exercised, that is to say, expressed, become strong. Those not in use atrophy and fall victims to arrested development. Man is the instrument of Deity. Through man does Deity create. And the artist is one who expresses for others their best thoughts and feelings. He may arouse in men emotions that were dormant, and so were unguessed. But under the spell of the artist's spirit, these dormant faculties are awakened from lethargy. They are exercised, and once the thrill of life is felt through them, they will probably be exercised again and again. All art is collaboration between the performer and the partaker. Music is especially a collaboration. It is a oneness of feeling, action and reaction, an intermittent current of emotion that plays backward and forward between the player and his audience. The player is the positive pole, or masculine principle, and the audience the negative pole, or feminine principle. In great oratory the same transposition takes place. Almost everyone can recall occasions when there was an absolute fusion of thought, feeling, and emotion between the speaker and the audience, when one mind dominated all, and every heart beat in unison with his. The great musician is the one who feels intensely, and is able to express vividly, and thus impart his emotion to others. Robert Schumann was such a man. In his youth, when he played at parlor gatherings, he could fuse the listeners into an absolute oneness of spirit. You cannot make others feel unless you yourself feel. You cannot make others see unless you yourself see. Robert Schumann saw. He beheld the moving pictures, and as they passed before him he expressed what he saw in harmonious sounds. His many admirers say he gave portraits on the piano, and by sounds would describe certain persons, so others who knew these persons would recognize them and call their names. Sterndale Bennett was told of Schumann's playing Weber's Invitation to the Dance, and accompanying it with the little verbal explanations of what he saw. Thus, "There," said the player as he struck the opening chords, "there he bows, and so does she. He speaks, she speaks, and oh, what a voice! How liquid! Listen! Hear the rustle of her gown. He speaks, a little deeper, you notice. You cannot hear the words, only their voices blending in with the music. Now they speak together. They are lovers surely. See, they understand. Oh, the waltz! See them take those first steps. They are swaying into time. Away! There they go! Look! You cannot hear their voices now, only see them. Schumann studied law, and had he followed that profession he would have made a master before a jury. He saw so clearly and felt so deeply, and was so full of generosity and bubbling good cheer, that he was irresistible. As we know, he proved so to Clara Wieck, who left father and mother and home to cleave to this unknown composer. This splendid young woman was 9 years younger than Robert, but she had already made a name and fortune for herself before they were married. In passing, it is well enough to call attention to the fact that this is one of the great loves of history. It ranks with the mating of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett. How strange that such things are so exceptional that the world takes note of them! Yet for quite a number of years after their marriage, Madame Schumann was at times asked this question, "Is your husband musical?" But Robert Schumann, like Robert Browning, was too big a man to be jealous of his wife. Jealousy is an acknowledgment of weakness and insecurity. Robert and Clara, their many dear friends always called them, they worked together, composed, sang, played, and grew great together. And as if to refute the carping critics who cry that domesticity and genius are incompatible, Clara Schumann became the happy mother of 8 children, and not a year passed but she appeared upon the concert stage, while a nurse held the baby in the wings. Schumann was very proud of his wife. He was grateful to her for her interpreting his songs in a way he could not. His lavish heart went out to every one who expressed the happiness and harmony which he felt singing in his soul. And so he welcomed all players and all singers, and all who felt the influence of an upward gravitation. Especially was he a friend of the young and unknown. His home at Dusseldorf was a Mecca for the aspiring, worthy and unworthy, and to these he gave his time, money, and influence. Genius must have recognition. We will discover and bring forth these beautiful souls. We will liberate and give them to the world, he used to say. Not only did he himself express great things, but he quoted others. Among those who had reverenced the Schumanns from afar came a young man of 20, small and fair-haired, from Hamburg. He was received at the regular Thursday night with various other strangers. These meetings were quite informal, and everybody was asked to play or sing. On being invited to play, our young man declined, but on a second visit he sat down at the piano and played. It was several minutes before the company ceased the little buzz of conversation and listened. The fledglings were never taken seriously except by the host and hostess. The youth leaned over the keyboard, and seemed to gather confidence from the sympathetic attitude of the listeners, and especially Clara Schumann, who had come forward and stood at his elbow. He played from Schumann's Carnival, and as he played, freedom came to him. He surprised himself. When he ceased playing, Robert kissed his cheek, and the company were vehement in their applause. Next day Schumann met Albert Dietrich, another disciple who had come from a distance to bask in the Schumann sunshine, and said with an air of mystery, "One has come of whom we shall yet hear great things. His name is Johannes Brahms." We have at least 4 separate accounts of Brahms' first appearance and behavior when he arrived at the city of Dusseldorf. These descriptions are by Robert and Clara Schumann, Dr. Dieters and Albert Dietrich. All agreed that Johannes Brahms was a most fascinating personality. Dieters and Dietrich were about the age of Brahms, and were lesser satellites swinging just outside the Schumann orbit. Very naturally, when a new devotee appeared, they gazed at him askance. Many visitors were coming and going, and from most of them there was nothing to fear. But when this short, deep-chested boy with flaxen hair appeared, Dietrich felt there was danger of losing his place at the right hand of the master. Brahms carried his chin in, and the crown of his head high. He was infinitely good-natured, met everybody on an equality, without abasement or condescension. He was modest, never pushed himself to the front, and was always ready to listen. A talented performer who can listen well is sure to be loved. And yet when Brahms went forward to play, there was just a suggestion of indifference to his hearers in his manner, and a half-haughty self-confidence that won before he had sounded a note. We always believe in people who believe in themselves. Young Brahms brought a letter of introduction from Joachim. But that was nothing. Joachim was always giving letters to everybody. He was like the men who sign every petition that is presented, or those other good men who give certificates of character to people they don't know, and recommendation letters to those for whom they have no use. So the letter went for little with Robert Schumann. It was the way Brahms approached the piano and settled his hands and great shock head over the keyboard that won. "He is no beginner," whispered Clara to Robert before Johannes had touched a key. It didn't take Brahms long to get acquainted. He mixed well. In a few days he dropped into that half-affectionate way of calling his host and hostess by their first names, and they in turn called him Johannes. And to me this is very beautiful, for at the last souls are all of one age. More and more we are realizing that getting old is only a bad habit. The only man who is old is the one who thinks he is. Of course these remarks about age do not exactly apply here, for no member of the trinity we are discussing was advanced in years. Robert was 43, Clara was 34, and Johannes was 20. Johannes Brahms was thrice well blessed in being well born. His parents were middle-class people, fairly well-to-do. They proved themselves certainly more than middle-class in intellect when they adopted the plan of being the companions and comrades of their children. Johannes grew up with no slavish fear of old folks. He had worked with his father, studied with him, learned lessons from books with his mother, and played four hands with her at the piano, by the hour, just for fun. Then when Remenyi came that way with his violin, and wanted a pianist, he took young Brahms. When their lines crossed the line of Liszt, they played for him at his inn, and then Liszt played for them. This Remenyi was our own old man Remenyi, who passed over only a year or so ago. I wonder if he was old man Remenyi then. He never really was an old man, and that appellation was more a mark of esteem than anything else, a sort of diminutive of goodwill. I met Remenyi at Chautoir, where he spent a month or more in 1893. He gave me my first introduction to the music of Brahms, of whom he never tired of talking. He considered Brahms without a rival, the culminating flower of modern music, and if old man slightly exaggerated his own influence in bringing Brahms out and presenting him to the world, I am not the one to charge it up against his memory. In explaining Brahms and his music, Remenyi used to grow animated, and when words failed he would say, "Here, it was just like this," and then he would seize his violin, the bow would wave through the air, and the notes would tell you how Brahms transposed Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata from A to B flat, a feat he never could have performed if Remenyi had not told him how. It was Remenyi who introduced Brahms to Joachim, and it was Joachim who introduced Brahms to Schumann, and it was Schumann's article, New Paths, in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, that placed Brahms on a pedestal before the world. Brahms was not the great man that Schumann painted, Remenyi thought, but the idolization caused him to put forth a heroic effort to be what Clara and Robert considered him. So it was really these two who compelled him to push on. Otherwise he might have relaxed into a mere concert performer or a leader of some subsidized band. Remenyi always seemed to me like a choice antique mosaic, a trifle weather-worn, set into the present. He used to quote Liszt as if he lived around the corner, and would criticize Wagner, and tell of Moscheles, Hartel, the Mendelssohns, and the Schumanns, as if they might all gather to-morrow and play for us at the Hall in the Grove. Recently I met a dear old Herr Kappes, 80 years younger, who knew the Mendelssohns and admired Brahms, loved Clara Schumann, and liked Remenyi, sometimes. They were too much alike, I fear, to like each other all the time. But the harmony is still in the heart of Herr Kappes. He gives music lessons and lectures, and will explain to you just how and where Brahms differs from Schumann, and where Schubert separates from both. Herr Kappes can speak 5 languages, but even with them all he finds difficulty in making his meaning clear, and at times adopts the Remenyi plan, and will just turn to the piano and cry, "It is like this, see! Schumann wrote it in this way," and then the strong hands will chase the keys down and back and over and up. "But Brahms took the motif and said it like this," and Herr Kappes will strike the bass a thunderous stroke, pause, look at you, glide back and down, up and over, and you are carried away in a swirl of sweet sounds, and see a pink face framed in its beautiful aureole of white hair. You listen, but you do not see the fine distinctions, because you do not care. Herr Kappes is all there is of it, so animated, so gentle, so true, so lovable, because he used to pay court to Fanny Mendelssohn, and then transferred his affections to Clara Schumann, and now just loves his art and everybody. End of section 23. Recording by Maggie Travers in Casilla, Mississippi. Section 24 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maggie Travers. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 12, Johannes Brahms, Part 2. Schumann's article, New Paths, at once determined Brahms' career. He must either live up to the mark that had been set for him, or else run away. I give below an extract from Robert's estimate of Brahms and his work. 10 years have passed away, as many as I formerly devoted to the publication of this paper, since I have allowed myself to commit my opinions to this soil so rich in memories. Often, in spite of an overstrained productive activity, I have felt moved to do so. Many new and remarkable talents have made their appearance, and a fresh musical power seemed about to reveal itself among the many aspiring artists of the day, even if their compositions were only known to the few. I thought to follow with interest the pathways of these elect. There must, after such a promise, suddenly appear one who should utter the highest ideal expression of the times, who should claim the mastership by no gradual development, but burst upon us fully equipped, as Minerva sprang from the brain of Jupiter. And he has come, this chosen youth, over whose cradle the Graces and heroes seem to have kept watch. His name is Johannes Brahms. He comes from Hamburg, where he has been writing in quiet obscurity, instructed by an excellent, enthusiastic teacher in the most difficult principles of his art, and lately introduced to me by an honored and well-known master. His mere outward appearance assures us that he is one of the elect. Seated at the piano, he discloses wondrous regions. We were drawn into an enchanted circle. Then came a moment of inspiration which transformed the piano into an orchestra of wailing and jubilant voices. There were sonatas, or rather veiled symphonies, songs whose poetry revealed itself without the aid of words, while throughout them all ran a vein of deep song melody, several pieces of a half demoniacal character, but of charming form. Then sonatas for piano and violin, string quartets, and each of these creations so different from the last that they appeared to flow from so many different sources. Then, like an impetuous torrent, he seemed to unite these streams into a foaming waterfall. Over the tossing waves the rainbow presently stretches its peaceful arch, while on the banks butterflies flit to and fro, and the nightingale warbles her song. Whenever he bends his magic wand towards great works, and the powers of orchestra and chorus lend him their aid, still more wonderful glimpses of the ideal world will be revealed to us. May the highest genius help him onward. Meanwhile that of another genius, that of modesty, seems to dwell within him. His comrades greet him at his first step in the world, where wounds may, perhaps, await him. But the bay and the laurel also, we welcome this valiant warrior. Robert Schumann had been before the public as an essayist, poet, pianist, and composer for 20 years. He had given himself without stint to almost every musical enterprise of Germany, and his sympathy was ever on tap for every needy and aspiring genius. You may give your purse, he who takes it trash, but to give your life's blood and then hope for a renewal of life's lease is vain. The public man owes to himself and to his Maker the duty of reserve. The desert and mountain are very necessary to the individual who gives himself to the public. That any man should so bestride the narrow world like a colossus that the multitude must stop to gaze, and thousands feed upon his words, is an abnormal condition. The only thing that can hold the balance true is solitude. Relaxation is the first requirement of strength. Watch the cat, the tiger, or the lion asleep. See what complete absence of intensity, what perfect relaxation! It is all a preparation for the spring. Schumann had not sought the mountain, nor abandoned himself to the woods in old shoes, corduroys, and a flannel shirt. Now he was paying the penalty of publicity. Virtue had gone out of him, and in the article just quoted there are signs that he is clutching for something. He hails this new star and proclaims him, because in some way he feels that the ruddy, valiant, and youthful Brahms is to consummate his work. Brahms is an extension of himself. It is a part of that longing for immortality. We perpetuate ourselves in our children, and look for them to accomplish what we have been unable to do. Johannes Brahms was the spiritual son of Robert Schumann. In less than a year after Brahms and Schumann first met, there were ominous signs and evil portents in the air. "Why do you play so fast, dear Johannes? I beg of you, be moderate!" cried Robert on one occasion. Brahms turned, and with his quick glance caught the ashy face and bloodshot eyes of a sick man. His reply was a tear and a hand-grasp. Soon, to Schumann, all music was going, at a gallop, and in his ears forever rang the sound of A. He could hear naught else. Tenderness, patience, and even love were of no avail. Indeed, love is not exempt from penalty. The law of compensation never rests. Nature forever strives for a right adjustment. The richness and intensity of Schumann's life were bought with a price. The first year after his marriage he composed 138 songs. Sonatas, scherzos, symphonies, and ballads followed fast, and in it all his gifted wife had gloried. But when, in 1854, Robert had, after sleepless nights, in a fit of frenzy thrown himself into the Rhine, and had been rescued, shattered, unable to recognize even his nearest friends, the loyal and devoted wife saw where she herself had erred. Writing to Brahms, she says, "I encouraged him in his work, and this fired his ambition to do and to become. Oh, why did I not restrain that intensity and send him away into the solitude to be a boy, to do nothing but frolic and play and bathe in the sunshine, and eat and sleep? The life of an artist is death. Kill ambition, my brother." Activity and rest, both are needed. The idea of the retreat in the Catholic Church is founded on stern, hygienic science. Wagner's forced exile was not without its advantages, and the retreats of Paganini and the retirements of Liszt were very useful factors in the devolution of their art. For the malady that beset Robert Schumann, there was no cure save death, his only rest, the grave. When his spirit passed away in 1856, his devoted wife and the loyal Brahms attended him. Owing to the insidious creeping of the disease, Schumann's affairs had got into bad shape, and it was now left to Brahms, more than all others, to smooth the way of life for the stricken wife and her fatherless brood. The versatility and sturdy common sense of Brahms were now in evidence. In business affairs he was ready, decisive, and systematic, and the delicacy, tact, and charming good nature he ever showed, revealed the man as a most extraordinary figure. Great talent is often bought at a price. How well we know this, especially with musicians. But Brahms was sane on all subjects. He could take care of his own affairs, lend a needed hand with others, but never meddle, smile with that half-sardonic grimace at all foolish little things, weep with the stricken when calamity came. Yet above it all the little man towered, carrying himself like the giant that he was. And yet he never made the mistake of taking himself too seriously. "I am trying to run opposition to Michelangelo's Moses," he once called to Dietrich as he leaned out of the window in the sunshine and stroked his flowing beard. In his later years many have testified to this Jove-like quality that Brahms diffused by his presence. No one could come into his aura and fail to see his sense of power. Around such souls is a sacred circle. If you are allowed to come within this boundary, it is only by sufferance. Within this space only the pure in heart can dwell. Tolstoy, in Anna Karenina, speaks of that quiet and constant light to be seen on the faces of those who are successful, those who know that their success is acknowledged by the world. Brahms was a successful man by temperament, for success, like East Aurora, is a condition of the mind. There is no tragedy for those who do not accept tragedy, and the treatment we receive from others is only our own reflected thought. Brahms thought well of everybody, if he thought of any one at all. He reveled in the sunshine, and everywhere made friends of children. "We saw Brahms on the hotel veranda at Domodossola," wrote a young woman to me in 1895, "and what do you think? He was on all fours, with 3 children on his back, riding him for a horse." For many years Brahms used to make an annual pilgrimage to Italy, and often on these tours at fairs he would fall in with gypsy bands. At such times he would always stop and listen, and would lustily applaud the performance. On one such occasion, Dietrich tells, the leader recognized Brahms, and instantly rapped for silence. He was seen to pass the whispered word along, and then the band struck up one of Brahms' pieces, greatly to the delight of the composer. He was a man of the people, and I'm glad to know that he hated a table d'hôte, smiled a smile of derision at all dress coats, and had small sympathy with pink teas, loved his friends, doted on babies, and was never so happy as when in the country, walking along grass-grown lanes in the early summer morning, when the dew was on and the air was melodious with the song of birds. He had a habit of going bareheaded, carrying his hat in his hand, and on these country walks, always with bared head, he would sing or whistle, and unconsciously in his mind the music would be taking shape that was to be written out later in the quiet of his study. Brahms knew the world, not simply one little part of it. He knew it as thoroughly as any man can, and was interested in it all. He knew the world of workers, the toilers and bearers of burden. He knew the weak and the vicious, and his heart went out to them in sympathy, for he knew his own heart and realized the narrow margin that separates the so-called good from the alleged bad. He knew that sin is only a wrong expression of life, and reacts to the terrible disadvantage of the sinner. He was interested in mechanics, bookbinding, printing, iron-working, carpentry, and was well acquainted with all new inventions and labor-saving devices. He knew the methods of farming, the different breeds of cattle. He knew what soil would produce best a certain crop, and understood rotation. He could call the wild birds by name and imitate their notes, and studied long their haunts and habits. That excellent man and talented, George Herschel, in a letter to a friend speaks of walking with Johannes Brahms along the highway, and Brahms suddenly calling in alarm, look out, you may kill it!" It was only a tumble-bug, but he shrank from putting foot on any living thing. Brahms reverenced all life, and felt in his heart that he was brother to that bug in the dust, to the birds that chirped in the hedgerows, and to the trees that lifted their outstretching branches to the sun. He was deeply religious, although he never knew it. All music is a hymn of praise, a song of thanksgiving, a chant of faith. Music is a making manifest to our dull ears the divine harmony of the universe, and thus all music is sacred music, and all true musicians are priests, for by their ministrations we are made to realize our oneness with the whole. Through music we read the universal. Music is the only one of the arts that cannot be prostituted to a base use. We hear of bad books, of the Index Expurgatorius, and in every state there are laws against the publication of immoral books and indecent pictures. We also hear of orders issued by the courts requiring certain statues to be removed or veiled, but no incident can be brought against music. It is the only one of the arts that is always pure. Brahms realized this and felt the dignity of his office, holding high the standard, and yet he knew that the toilers in the fields were doing a service to humanity just as necessary as his own, and possibly this is why he uncovered, walking with bared head, "All is holy, all is good. It is all God's world, and all the men and women in it are his children." For 42 years Brahms was the devoted friend of Clara Schumann. She was 13 years his senior, yet their spirits were as children together. From the first he was to her Johannes, and she was Clara to him. A few of their letters have been published in the Revue des Deux Mondes, and this woman, who was a great-grandmother, and had 60 years before captured a world, then in her 75th year, wrote to her "Dear Johannes," with all the gentle fervor of a girl of 20, congratulating him on some recent success. In reply he writes back to his "Dear Clara," in gracious banter, mentions rheumatism in his legs as an excuse for bad penmanship, hopes she is keeping up her practice, tells of a Steinway grand that someone has sent him, and regrets that she does not come to try it four hands, as he has failed utterly to get out of it alone the melody that he knows is there. Brahms never married. The bond between himself and Clara was too sacred to allow another to sever or share it. And yet the relationship was so high, so frank, so openly avowed, that no breach of scandal has ever smirched it. The purity and excellence of it all has been its own apology, as love ever should be its own excuse for being. For about 3 months every year these two friends dwelt near each other. Together they worked, composed, sang, read, wrote, and roamed the woods. "None of Madame Schumann's children is as young as she is," wrote Dr. Hanslick, when Clara was 60 and Johannes was 47. With the hope of passing for her father, Brahms is cultivating a patriarchal beard, continues Hanslick. In his essay on Friendship, Emerson speaks of the folly of forcing our personal presence on the friend we love best, and of the faith that ideality brings. Something of this thought is shown in the letters of Madame Schumann to Brahms, and in his to her. Often for 6 months they would not meet, he doing his work in his own way, she doing hers, but each ever conscious of the life and love of the other, feeding on the ideal, writing or not writing, but glorying in each other's triumphs, lives linked first by the love of a third person, cemented by dire calamity, and then fused by a oneness of hope and aspiration. Brahms' nature was too decidedly masculine, that is to say, one-sided, to exist without the love of a woman. Clara Schumann, gentle, generous, motherly, plastic, needed Johannes no less than he needed her. When Clara's spirit passed away, in May, 1896, Brahms attended her funeral at Frankfurt. Hero that he was in body and spirit, the shock unnerved him. No rebound came, every bodily faculty seemed to have lost its buoyancy. The doctors tried to cheer him by telling him that he had no organic ailment, and that 20 years of life and work were before him. He knew better, and told them so. Men do not live any longer than they wish to. "Shall I live to see the anniversary of her death?" asked Brahms of the doctor in March, 1897. "Oh, undoubtedly. You can live many years if you only will to," was the answer. 3 weeks later, on April 3rd, Max Kalbrick telegraphed to Widman this message: "Brahms fell asleep early this morning." So here endeth Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians, being volume 14 of the series, as written by Elbert Hubbard, edited and arranged by Fred Bann, borders and initials by Roycroft Artist, and produced by the Roycrofters at their shops, which are in East Aurora, Erie County, New York, 1922. End of section 24. Recording by Maggie Travers in Casilla, Mississippi. End of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Musicians by Elbert Hubbard.